Chapter 5. The Persian War down to Ecbatana, 330. Thus peace in Greece was restored, and after his return to Macedonia in October 335, Alexander could finally devote himself to the preparations for his Asiatic expedition. But it was only an enforced peace that prevailed in Hellas, after the melancholy experiences of the last 2 years. No one saw that more clearly than Alexander, and he drew his conclusions accordingly as regards both his preparations and his plans of campaign. Being necessarily mistrustful of a large section of the Greeks, he left the faithful Antipater in Macedonia with half his Macedonian levy, 12,000 phalangites and 1,500 cavalry. Antipater was also charged with the oversight of the League as representative of the hegemon, perhaps with the title of strategos. The same mistrust caused him to limit the contingents he called for from the League to no more than what a regard for the Pan-Hellenic campaign seemed to require. Apart from the fleet of 160 triremes supplied by the League and therefore called the Greek fleet, only 7,000 infantry and 600 cavalry are mentioned, and in addition 1,500 Thessalian horse. The latter, presumably attached to the king as their archon and enjoying his special confidence, played an important part in the great battles in Asia. On the other hand, we look in vain for the 7,000 League infantry in the battlefront. One gets the impression that, apart from the Thessalians, Alexander took the Greek contingents rather as hostages, who would help to keep Hellas quiet. The Greek fleet at first was prudently kept out of action. This was anyhow inevitable owing to the great superiority, both in numbers and quality, of the Persian fleet of 400 ships of war, with their first-rate Phoenician and Cypriot vessels. The naval supremacy of the enemy had a determining effect on Alexander's plan of campaign. As the Persian fleet controlled the sea, the greatest danger was the possibility that the great king might transfer the war to Greece and by his immense treasures coerce the Greeks into fighting against him. As the decision at sea was out of the question, owing to the small size and unreliable nature of the Greek fleet, Alexander formed the clever scheme of paralyzing the maritime superiority of his opponent by first conquering with his land army the Mediterranean coast regions of the Persian Empire. In order to occupy the recruiting grounds and stations of the Persian fleet, and above all, the Phoenician coast, he did not move into the interior of Asia until with unwearying energy he had carried out this program to the last detail, as we cannot guess the scope of his plans of conquest when he crossed into Asia. We do not know how far this strategic plan was formed beforehand or took shape during his victorious advance. Alexander's whole strength was in his land army, on it, and especially on the incomparable Macedonian elite, which his father had bequeathed to him trained to perfection, and also on the self-confidence of military genius was based in absolute assurance of victory. This not only filled the soul of the young king, but he also succeeded in inspiring with it his Macedonians who were enthusiastically devoted to him. Without this assurance of victory and the invincible will to conquer, many of Alexander's actions and successes would be unintelligible. Numerically, his army was far inferior to that opposed to it, inclusive of those Greek contingents and about 5,000 Greek mercenaries, and of contingents of Thracians, Agrianians, and other Balkan races. The army of Alexander, when it crossed into Asia, amounted only to about 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Among the latter were 1,500 Macedonian cavalry, heteroi, who, apart from the royal regiment, were recruited from the coast lands added by Philip to his kingdom. The levies of the nobility from the districts of Old Macedonia, however, were left behind with Antipater. The opposition of the men of Old Macedonia, which was later directed against Alexander, when he went counter to Macedonian interest, came rather from the Macedonian infantry than from the heteroi. The question, how many troops Darius had at his disposal, when so framed, admits of no answer. His empire, which extended to the frontiers of India, had theoretically incalculable possibilities, but in practice they were considerably limited by the immense distances and the consequent difficulties of a levy. We can only ask, how many troops the great king actually put into the field against Alexander in individual battles. If we abandon the fantastically colossal numbers, which tradition gives us, as it did in the Persian wars of the 5th century, it is incontestable that Alexander won his 3 pitched battles, the Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, against superior numbers which grew larger on each occasion. Besides his picked troops from Persia and eastern Iran, the great king, like his predecessors, relied especially on his Greek mercenaries, who, in spite of the decree of the Corinthian League that no Greeks might enlist as mercenaries under the Persians, served him to the number of many thousands, some of them loyally to the very end. Still more marked was Alexander's inferiority in finance. The great king had the disposal of unlimited treasures of silver and gold stored up in his capitals. At his accession, Alexander not only found in the treasury barely 60 talents of ready money, but also took over a debt of 500 talents, to which he had to add 800 talents of personal debt. On the assumption that these figures are correct, it would be surprising if, according to another account, which is equally incapable of being tested, Alexander owed only 200 talents when he left for Asia. In any case, he was in debt when he crossed the Hellespont. He is said to have had then merely 70 talents in cash for the maintenance of his army, and provision for no more than 30 days. If he had not possessed that confidence of victory, he might be called an adventurer. But he calculated with absolute certainty that the enemy's country would feed his army, and his calculation proved correct. His assurance of victory partially explains why he took with him from the start a historian, who was to write a history to inform the Greeks of his great deeds in Asia. This was Callisthenes of Olynthus, nephew and pupil of Aristotle, whom the latter had recommended to the king for this purpose. He was already well known by a Greek history, Hellenica, which had recently appeared, through the agency of Callisthenes, who was to celebrate him as the realizer of the pan-Hellenic idea. Alexander intended first and foremost to influence Greek feeling. At the same time, the marvels of the East which he hoped to behold were to be described for the benefit of the Greeks. The mental changes of the king led later to a tragic conflict with his historian. It was the first literary description of the Asiatic expedition, and up to then, under the eyes of Alexander himself, Callisthenes adopted the language of Pan-Greek. On account of his proximity to the king, what we learn of his work claims our special interest. He tells us how Alexander wished to be thought of by the Greeks. But, because the standpoint is so partial, we naturally have to use his statements critically. On the other hand, the official description of the daily actions of Alexander the Royal Gazette, Ephemerides, was not intended for publication. From the day of his accession, it was composed by Eumenes of Cardia, the chief of his secretariat, and it had certainly been begun under Philip, whom Eumenes had served for several years in the same capacity. We owe our chief idea of the nature of this official journal to the fact that Ptolemy I, king of Egypt, used it as the authority for his memoirs, and as Ptolemy was one of Arian chief's authorities, this explains why the latter's work read like a diary. The Gazette was not intended to glorify the monarch, but to serve the practical requirements of government. In the king's entourage we find besides Callisthenes other historians as well as philosophers and poets, but these generally joined the traveling court later. The surveying section, Bimatiste, whose business it was to measure and enter in a journal the distances covered by Alexander's army, and who also added accounts of the peculiarities of the countries it traversed, no doubt accompanied the king from the start. But the specialist, who had to investigate the flora, fauna, and mineral wealth of the newly discovered countries of the Far East, were enlisted, in some cases, as time went on. From the very first it was apparent to Alexander, the pupil of Aristotle, that this Asiatic campaign was to be not merely a military expedition, but a great civilizing event. For he aimed not only at introducing Greek culture into the East, but also at revealing to the Greeks the nature and culture of Asia. His campaign was at the same time an enterprise of research and discovery, which was to have new and fruitful results for Greek science. To be sure, he could as yet have had no conception to what extent he would ultimately succeed. No doubt, it was only in the course of his victorious advance that these aims assumed a more definite and solid shape. The Persian Empire, against which Philip had opened the attack and Alexander now took the field, had lost the youthful vitality which it possessed under Darius I, but nevertheless, it was no longer the depressed and internally unsound empire, which a few decades earlier had come near to dismemberment, owing to the insurrections of ambitious satraps and vassals, and the rebellion of important areas like Egypt and Cyprus. The energy of Artaxerxes III, Ulcas, by overcoming these dangers and especially by the reconquest of Egypt, in which his success was chiefly due to the help of Greek officers and mercenaries, had once more firmly compacted the empire into a world empire, so that it now confronted the Macedonians as a strong and imposing colossus. In the spring of 336, when Philip sent his vanguard over the Dardanelles, Arcis, who, after the death of his father Ochus, 338, had been raised to the throne by the all-powerful eunuch Bagoas, was still reigning. But soon afterwards, perhaps in May 336, Bagoas put Arcis away, and placed on a throne Codomanus, a prince of a parallel branch of Achaemenids, who promptly poisoned him to win greater freedom of action. This Darius III, as he called himself, was the unlucky monarch on whose shoulders fell the task of defending his realm against an Alexander. We are told of the great personal bravery which in youth he displayed in fighting the Cadicians. But in the decisive moments at Issus and Gaugamela, when he saw the superhuman figure of Alexander charging madly upon him, he was seized with panic on each occasion, turned his chariot to rapid flight, and left his brave men to fight and fall. He is to a great extent personally responsible for the downfall of his empire. The troops which Philip had sent ahead to Asia Minor under Parmenio and Attalus, after a victorious advance at first, were pressed back again to the Dardanelles. Our inadequate authorities tell us merely that Parmenio, who had at first advanced by way of Ephesus to Magnesia on the Meander, was there defeated by the great king's excellent general Memnon, forced to retreat northwards and maneuvered back to the Dardanelles, so that at last the Macedonians held only Abydos and Rhoetium on the Trojan coast. Though the murder of Philip and the tragic fall of Attalus had a paralyzing and disturbing influence on the operations, one derives the impression that Memnon showed himself a better general than Parmenio. Alexander may have been well satisfied with the result, which secured him the bridgehead for his crossing into Asia, and reserved to him himself the glorious overture of the liberation of the Greek cities. So he issued no orders for a second advance, but in the autumn of 335, summoned Parmenio to Pella to help him in the arming of the host. Alexander thus gave Parmenio, who was then about 60 and had proved his efficiency in many of Philip's battles, a unique position above all his other commanders. He did not assign him the permanent command of a single division, but kept him by his side without any special command. Yet we must not describe Parmenio as the chief of Alexander's staff, or as his mulke. Sometimes before important decisions, for the purpose of deliberation, Alexander summoned a war council of officers, or the comrades, personally attached to him. But he never had a regular general staff in the modern sense. He was his own mulke. Nor did Alexander, in strategic questions, allow himself to be influenced by the generally divergent views of the cautious Parmenio. Nevertheless, he obviously had great confidence in him as a tactician, for in the 3 pitched battles in Asia, he gave him the command of the defensive wing, while he reserved to himself that of the offensive. How loyal the old general was to the royal house he had shown in Asia Minor, where in obedience to Alexander's command he gave Attalus up to justice, though he was his son-in-law, as soon as the latter's high treason was unmasked. It was also anxiety for the dynasty which made him and Antipater counsel Alexander not to cross over to Asia until he had married and begotten an heir to the throne. One can understand how Alexander, who passionately longed for the opening of the Great War, rejected this idea. But the anxiety expressed in this advice was not without justification. For if at Alexander's death a son of his by a lawful Macedonian marriage had been forthcoming, the fate of his world empire would perhaps have been different. Finally, all preparations were finished, and the march was begun in the early spring of 334. Alexander led his army from Amphipolis along the Macedonian coast to the Hellespont, which he reached at Sestos in the Carinese. It was lucky for him that the Persians had not thought of preventing his crossing with their vastly superior fleet, an omission which was a strange mistake. So by help of the 160 triremes and merchant ships requisitioned for the purpose, the army was ferried over without fighting to Abydos on the opposite coast. While Alexander left this task to Parmenio, he was himself impelled by his romantic feelings to visit the sacred sites of the Iliad. Accompanied by friends and a small body of infantry, he went to the southern promontory of the Carinese, where a tumulus passed for the grave of Protesilaus, who, according to the legend, was the first of Agamemnon's men to be killed in the landing. To him, Alexander offered sacrifice that he himself might succeed in making a more fortunate landing. So, when on his flagship he crossed to the Trojan coast in the center of the Dardanelles, he sacrificed the gods of the sea, Poseidon, Amphitrite, and the Nereids, and when he had come near to the further shore, he hurled his spear on to the sandy beach, jumped down after it in full armor, and cried out that he received Asia from the gods as land won by the spear. This symbolic annexation of the enemy's country is related by Cleitarchus alone, but it is so characteristic of Alexander's manner that we may regard it as historical. The wording, however, of his exclamation rests on authority too doubtful to justify conclusions as to the extent of his military plans at the time. Next, he went up to Ilium and enthusiastically reveled in recollections of the Trojan War. He dedicated his armor to Athena, and in place of it took a sacred shield, supposed to date from the heroic age, and on the altar of Zeus Hercaeus sacrificed to Priam, who, according to the legend, was slain by Neoptolemus, son of Achilles. Thus, as descendant of Achilles, Alexander sought to allay the wrath of Priam. In the plain below, he and his friend Hephaestion laid wreaths on the mounds which were supposed to cover the remains of Achilles and Patroclus. This excursion to Ilium gives us a profound insight into the romantic soul of the young king. After he had rejoined his army, which, in the meantime, had been transported across by Parmenio, he advanced, carefully reconnoitering the country as he went, to meet the foe, who, as he had been informed, had concentrated his forces not far off at Zelia, south of the Sea of Marmora, by order of the great king, who had as yet no correct idea of the danger which threatened him from Alexander. The satraps and generals, most immediately concerned, had assembled their forces from the countries on this side of Mount Taurus, and joined Memnon and his troops. In the war council at Zelia, Memnon urgently dissuaded a pitched battle, and proposed an alternative plan, to retire into the interior and by devastating the settlements and destroying the crops to reduce Alexander to extremities and force him to retreat. Meanwhile, carrying the war over into Europe by means of the fleet. This clever plan, which shows profound insight into Alexander's precarious situation, and would have put him into a position similar to that of Napoleon in Russia, was received as coming from a foreigner, with the most violent opposition from the proud Persians, who refused to lay in ashes a single house. Inspired by this feeling of superiority, they determined rather, at the gates of Asia, to force Alexander to a battle. Nevertheless, they were prudent enough not to meet him in the open field, but to oppose an obstacle to his frontal attack. So they marched westwards to the lower course of the Granicus, a mountain stream, which descends from Ida and empties itself into the Sea of Marmora, and posted themselves on the right or southern bank. The river there runs through flat country, but the southern banks rise steeply in places to a height of as much as 8 feet. By a glaring error of tactics, they placed their excellent cavalry, according to Arrian, 20,000 strong, in front on the steep banks, where they were unable to charge, and posted their infantry of Greek mercenaries, also 20,000 according to the same authority, some distance behind on a level elevation. When Alexander arrived from the northwest, with his columns in marching order, and surveyed a position which was favorable for him, he determined to make use of this mistake of the enemy by an immediate attack which would take them by surprise. The cautious Parmenio advised him to encamp for the night and attack in the early morning, but Alexander rejected the advice and ordered his troops who were experienced in maneuvering to form in battle line from column of route. For the first time he employed the oblique battle array, which his father had borrowed and developed from an idea of Epaminondas. He divided his army into an offensive wing on the right commanded by himself, and a defensive wing on the left, the command of which he entrusted to Parmenio. In the next 2 great battles at Issus and Gaugamela, he also used the same tactics, but each of the 3 battles exhibits peculiarities corresponding to the local conditions, for Alexander knew no fixed pattern. The fundamental idea of all 3 battles was, by an impetus attack of the Macedonian cavalry on the right, to pierce the enemy's left wing, and then, turning to the left if possible, to roll up the enemy's line, while the regiments of the phalanx, which were stationed in the center, and covered by cavalry on the left, followed more slowly en echelon, had in the meantime to make contact with the enemy and engage him with the support of their cavalry. The special feature of the Battle of the Granicus was that Alexander did not charge the extreme left wing of the enemy, where Memnon was, and where, in expectation of Alexander, the Persians had posted their ranks in very close order. Instead, he ordered light troops of foot and horse with a squadron of heavy cavalry to attack and hold them, while he himself at the head of the heteroi looked for a point of attack further towards the center on the left of them. Amid the blare of trumpets and the battle cry of his men, Alexander rushed into the river, which was then swollen, as it was the month of May, and across up the steep bank, where there was a violent cavalry engagement on a broad front. Further to the left, his other troops gradually reached the opposite bank and took up the fight. The battle raged most madly round Alexander himself, who was engaged at close quarters with several Persian nobles, among them Mithridates, son-in-law of Darius, to whom he gave his death blow. While still engaged with Roseses, he was himself in the greatest danger of his life, when Spithridates, the satrap of Lydia and Ionia, approached him from behind with uplifted scimitar to deal the coup de grace. His life was saved by Cleopas, the son of Dropidas, the commander of the royal regiment, who cut off Spithridates' uplifted arm, or, according to Plutarch, ran him through the body. It is a startling thought how different would have been the course of the world's history if Cleopas had not dealt his blow at the critical moment, and Alexander had fallen on the threshold of his glory. But they are wrong who have sought to deprive him of the title of one of the world's greatest generals, because on this occasion, and later too, he bravely joined in the actual fighting. In the oblique battle order, the commander's place was necessarily at the head of the offensive wing. It was at that point alone that a decisive change in the direction of the attack towards the center might take place during the battle. and in those days there were no reserves, which in modern strategy compelled the general to stay behind the battle line, in order that he may launch them at the proper moment. When Alexander had victoriously broke through with his heteroi, and turning leftwards was pressing to the center, the flight of the Persian cavalry began, and when, after crossing the river, Parmenio had successfully resisted the hostile attack, in which the Thessalian horse had especially distinguished themselves, the defeat of their left made the Persian ranks waver, and soon the flight became general, starting with his whole line to pursue them, for, like his father, he aimed at the complete annihilation of the enemy. Alexander came upon the Greek mercenaries in the rear, who, by the inconceivable tactics of the Persian nobles, had been made witness of the cavalry fighting without taking any part themselves. He ordered his phalanx to attack them in front, while his cavalry took them on the flanks, and so this first-class body of Greek troops was destroyed, with the exception of about 2,000 survivors. This, however, prevented any further pursuit on the part of the cavalry. Thus, in a few afternoon hours of a day in May 334, a great victory was won, above all by the genius of Alexander's generalship, but also owing to the superior arms of his troops, for, as the well-informed Arrian relates, in the decisive cavalry engagement the Macedonian thrusting lance proved its superiority to the Persian throwing spear. These thrusting lances were all the more formidable, as the Macedonians, by Alexander's orders, aimed as much as possible at the faces of the enemy, and this superiority of weapons must have given his cavalry from the start a great confidence in victory. The loss of the heteroi were quite small. Only 25 of the regiments sent against Memnon had fallen, while the rest of the cavalry had lost over 60, and the infantry about 30. Such small numbers would have a suspicious sound, but we must add the wounded, of whom perhaps many more died. Alexander ordered the sculptor Lysippus to make statues of those 25 heteroi, which were set up at Dion in Macedonia. The families were given exemption from taxation. The Persians must have suffered heavily, and in particular many of their leaders fell. The day after the battle, Alexander gave solemn burial not only to his own men, but to the Persians. He showed his humane disposition also in his kindly attention to the wounded. He made them individually display to him their wounds, and relate how they had got them, and gave them a kindly ear, even when they were somewhat vainglorious. One can conceive how enthusiastically the army was devoted to such a leader. With subtle diplomacy, which was suggested to him by his recent troubles in Greece, Alexander, in the capacity of generalissimo of the Pan-Hellenic War of Revenge, published to the world this victory of the Granicus as a victory of the Corinthian League. This is the meaning of the dedicatory inscription he ordered for the 300 sets of Persian armor, which he sent to Athens to be offered to the goddess on the Acropolis. Alexander the son of Philip and the Hellenes, all but the Lacedaemonians, dedicated this as booty from the barbarians who inhabit Asia. Not a word about his Macedonians, and out of the Greek contingents, only the cavalry had been engaged. It is also noticeable that he does not describe himself as king, and that in the language of the Pan-Hellenic propaganda, he calls the Persians barbarians. In the same way, it was with the intention of honoring the League, and putting himself merely in the position of their elected generalissimo, that he sent the captured Greek mercenaries in chains to forced labor in Macedonia, giving as his reason, because, contrary to the resolution of the League of Hellenes, they had fought for the barbarians against Hellas. The court historian Callisthenes certainly celebrated the Granicus as a Pan-Hellenic victory, and when he said the battle was fought on the Adrastine fields, and, in explanation of the name, mentioned the old king Adrastus, who founded the cult of Nemesis in the region, he saw probably a divine dispensation in the fact that Alexander had here won the victory as the avenger of Greece. And yet Alexander went not merely as the general of the League, but also as king, who aimed at conquering territory for himself. There is assuredly a correct idea conveyed in the story of Granicus, how he threw his spear before him on landing. From the moment he trod on Asiatic soil, he regarded it, as his further actions show, as land won by his spear, in the sense in which the Diadochi use the same expression to assert the lawfulness of their conquests. No doubt, as general of the League, Alexander undertook as his first duty the liberation of the Greek cities of Asia Minor from the Persian yoke. But what lay outside of these cities and their territories he conquered from the first for himself. Yet he came not as a devastator, but as the future ruler who saw in the conquered peoples his subjects. He wished to reconcile them to the new rule by taking account of their national characteristics, and by being prepared to secure to them their old traditions as far as the security of his empire permitted, in order that under the new conditions they might settle down peaceably. Scarcely had he entered the country when he began to rule as its new king. Immediately after the Battle of the Granicus, he organized the administration of the satrapy Hellespontine Phrygia, whose satrap Arsaces had escaped from the battle. He appointed in his stead a Macedonian noble called Casa. It was most significant, and perhaps very surprising to his Macedonians, that he gave Casa not the Macedonian title, but the old Persian title of satrap. Kashrapvan, protector of the country, to which the population had been accustomed for centuries past. But the title Casa received exactly the same function as Arsaces, nor did Alexander make any change in his demands on his new subjects. The same tribute as they had hitherto paid to the great king, they were now to pay to their new master. He caused Parmenio forthwith to occupy the seat of government of the satrapy, Daciclium. So Alexander stepped immediately into the rights of the great king, whose crown lands he further claimed for himself. These measures, by which he did not incorporate the new conquest into his Macedonian kingdom, but placed them independently beside it, show us that from the first, though we can form no accurate idea of his plans and hopes of that date, he did not contemplate a small rounding off of his Macedonian kingdom. The immediate effect of the victory of the Granicus was that the neighboring parts of Western Asia Minor fell to Alexander without any fighting. When he reached Sardis, the seat of government of the Lydian satrapy, not merely the city, but also the citadel, which was supposed to be impregnable, together with its rich treasures, were surrendered to him, and he placed over them a Macedonian as commandant. Here, too, Alexander showed that he came not to enslave, but to liberate, and was minded to pay respect to national characteristics. To the Lydians, who were a people of ancient civilization, and had once, particularly in religion and music, greatly stimulated Greek culture, he gave back their old Lydian laws, which they had had before the Persian conquest. He showed also that he had come to introduce Greek culture into the East, for on the summit of the citadel of Sardis he erected a temple and altar to Olympian Zeus, the Pan-Hellenic god. After having appointed a Macedonian, Asandar, as satrap of Lydia, on this occasion Alexander gave the control of finance to an officer of his own. He reached the coast at Ephesus, and began, according to his Pan-Hellenic commission, to liberate the Greek cities. From Ephesus, he detached a large body of troops to occupy the Aeolian and northern Ionian cities, and in the south Magnesia and Tralles on the Maeander declared their adhesion to him. Everywhere he caused the oligarchs to be overthrown and the democracies reinstated with their former laws. This was done here and elsewhere as a countermeasure against the Persian government, which had always favored oligarchs. Naturally, the payment of tribute to Persia by the Greek cities was abolished, Everywhere the liberation from Persian rule was greeted with enthusiasm, and Alexander was celebrated as the liberator. Though the assignment of the Greeks of Asia Minor by the king's peace to the Persian Empire had conferred many economic advantages on them through the unrestricted intercourse they enjoyed with the interior, with the result that they were in a better material position than the free Greeks of the motherland with their internecine quarrels. Yet the history of the Ionians showed that they had always felt the yoke of the foreigner as a sore burden, and that they, too, should not have been disputed, regarded freedom as the greatest blessing. A 3rd century inscription from Brun gives noble expression to this idea when it says, "There is nothing greater for Greek men than freedom." The question how Alexander organized the liberated Greeks of Asia Minor is hard to answer in the almost complete silence of our tradition. But lately some arguments have been adduced which seem to indicate that, as previously the islands off the coast belonged to the Corinthian League, so now the cities of the mainland were made members of the League by Alexander, who, doubtless, followed the intention of his father Philip. The particular measures taken by Alexander agree with this assumption. The only special feature is that the Asiatic members of the League were not bound to furnish contingents for the army and fleet, like the states of the motherland, but to pay contributions in money, taxes. That the Ionic federal system, which had revived before the coming of Alexander, about the middle of the century, was still in existence, is no argument against this view, for in Greece leagues had been admitted as members. In any case, the other view that, instead of introducing the Greeks of Asia Minor into the Corinthian League, Alexander organized them in several local leagues which he made dependent on himself, is incapable of proof. Proofs are equally lacking for the widespread theory that immediately after their liberation, the Greeks of Asia Minor paid divine honors to Alexander. The instances quoted for this belong to a later date. It was only at 2 points on the west coast that Alexander encountered opposition, and that where Greek mercenaries were to be found in large numbers, at Miletus and Halicarnassus, the Persian commandant of Miletus, who had at first been willing to surrender the town, later on resisted, relying upon the arrival of the Persian fleet. This had to anchor outside off Mount Michael, since Alexander's fleet had previously succeeded in taking up a position by the island of Lade, immediately in front of the town's harbor. With the siege artillery, which he here used for the first occasion, a breach was made in the walls, and the town stormed, while simultaneously the Greek fleet entered the harbor and closed its mouth. Alexander pardoned the Milesians, who had evidently been coerced by the Persian garrison, and granted them freedom, and thus they too joined the Corinthian League. They thanked him by electing him Stephanophorus of their city for the next year, 334-3. In the list of these eponymous officials which has come down to us, he is called simply Alexander, son of Philip, without the title of king, which at this time he did not use, being hegemon of the League, where the didactory inscription of the Temple of Athena at Priene describes him as king. The meaning is that he did not found it out of League moneys. Though the fleet had done him good service at Miletus, he disbanded the greater part of it, retaining only the 20 Athenian ships as hostages. This resolution, which at first sight seemed surprising, was rendered necessary by scarcity of money. Perhaps also he hesitated to expose his ships to the possibility of a defeat by the far superior Persian fleet then stationed at Samos. At Halicarnassus, the capital of Achaia, Alexander met with a much stronger resistance, for his greatest antagonist, Memnon the Rhodian, to whom Darius had just given supreme command of the Asiatic coast and the fleet, undertook the defense in person. Here a long siege was necessary, since the city was strongly fortified both by nature and art. A division of the Persian fleet lay at anchor in the harbor, but the city could not hold out indefinitely against the superior siegecraft of Alexander. After engagements in which both sides were alternately successful and several futile sallies of the brave garrison, Memnon was obliged to evacuate the city and leave it to the conqueror. Only the 2 citadels continued in Persian occupation. Alexander could not stay for them, but left a corps behind, which after some time effected a capitulation. Memnon himself, who had conducted the defense with brilliant skill, escaped to the island of Kos. How far Alexander was from following any rule of thumb in arranging the satrapies, he showed by entrusting Caria to the old Princess Ada of the Carian dynastic house, who had formerly ruled as widow of her brother and husband Adreus. She had met him with homage when he entered Caria, handed over to him the town of Alinda, which belonged to her, and proposed to adopt him as her son. Alexander restored the town to her and accepted the adoption. He was therefore to the Carians the son of their ruler, and all sting of foreign domination was removed. The sort of fiction which the Alexander romance subsequently fabricated in the case of Egypt and Persia, that he was the son of an Egyptian or Persian king, was here anticipated by historical fact. By this attitude to Ada, Alexander showed that he understood the special characteristics of the subjected people. We may consider strange the statements about the parts this woman played, but they are explained by the fact that in Caria there were survivals of the so-called matriarchy which had once prevailed widely in the pre-Greek Mediterranean world. Since Alexander in this case conferred the satrapy on a woman, and a native to boot, he naturally separated from it the military command and gave that to a Macedonian officer. Ada received merely the civil functions. This separation of civil and military posts, which Alexander carried out in this instance for the first time, he afterwards adopted as a principle when he appointed Orientals to satrapies. The young Macedonians, who had married shortly before the war, were now sent home on leave for the winter, a measure as politic as it was humane, which called forth warm gratitude. Parmenio was dispatched with the League troops to occupy Phrygia, and Alexander himself started during the winter months to traverse the southern coast of Asia Minor, in accordance with his strategic plan of paralyzing the enemy's fleet by occupying the seaboard. He marched along the coast of Lydia and Pamphylia as far as Side, without encountering any serious resistance. Only when he turned off northwards through Pisidia did he have severe fighting wild mountaineers. By way of Calanae, he arrived at his winter quarters at Gordium, the Pharyngian capital on the river Sangarius, celebrated in legend. There Parmenio and his army met him, and in spring came the men who had been on furlough and the new levies from home. Gordium had been specially chosen as the rendezvous, because its position was convenient for reinforcements from Macedonia. The first year of the war had produced striking successes. By the victory of the Granicus, all Asia Minor up to the Sangarius had fallen into Alexander's hands. The Persian fleet had no port to put in at on the coast as far as Cilicia. There was no Persian army any longer in Asia Minor, and the first point of the Pan-Hellenic programs had been quickly achieved. The Greek cities of Asia Minor were freed from the Persian yoke and incorporated in the Corinthian League. These cities, as the study of the buildings of many of them proves, now entered on a new period of great development. The wide regions outside them were occupied by Alexander as crown lands and administered by his satraps. In view of the rapid victorious advance of the young hero, how could it be doubted that he was under the special protection of the gods? They often sent lucky omens, which were interpreted either by the seers of his camp, the chief of whom was then Aristander of Telmasus, or at times by the king himself. Apart from the usual daily sacrifices, he did not neglect to give visible expression of his reverence and gratitude to the gods on special occasions. At Ephesus, for example, where he entered for the first time a liberated Ionian city, he led a solemn procession in honor of Artemis, with his whole army equipped as for battle. He honored the goddess further by ordering that the Epsians should henceforth pay to her for the erection of her temple the tribute which they had previously paid to the great king. The relation of Alexander to the gods being so close, it was natural to attribute lucky happenings to the immediate intervention of the gods. When Alexander was on the Pamphylian coast, he wanted to go along a narrow shore road, which was passable solely when the north winds blew back to the tide, and at the moment the south wind which had been blowing hitherto suddenly changed to a north wind, so that he was able to get through. According to Arrian, not only his followers, but Alexander himself saw in this a divine dispensation. this is not presumption, but rather a recognition that as man he would have been powerless without divine aid. Later, his court historian, Callisthenes, made something quite different of it. In his panegyric on Alexander, he related how the sea had retired from him, and bowed before him as its lord, thus performing its prostration of reverence, prosykinesis. Alexander is made out to be a superhuman divine being, to whom the elements do homage. But this narrative is influenced by the elevation of Alexander to the position of a son of Ammon, 331, and the metaphor of prosykinesis points to the time when he began to receive this oriental homage from his Persian subjects. On the contrary, at the time of the experience on the Pamphylian coast, such ideas were completely foreign to Alexander and his followers. The incident simply made him appear as a favorite and protege of the gods. We are reminded of another great problem of Alexander's history, the gradual appearance of the idea of world sovereignty, by an event which now took place at Gordian. The natives of this place had an old oracle, according to which the man who unfastened the famous knot that tied the yoke to the ancient chariot of King Gordius in the citadel would become lord of Asia. When Alexander heard of this in Gordium, he was again seized by that longing for the mysterious, of which mention has been made before, and so inspected the chariot, after vain endeavors to find the ends of the strap. By a quick resolution he drew his sword and cut the knot. In the night, thunder and lightning followed, which he took as a divine intimation that his method of loosing the knot had been accepted by the gods. He had completed belief in oracles, and this promise from the ancient East of the sovereignty over Asia must have influenced him deeply henceforward. Meantime in the West, after his departure from Halicarnassus, events had occurred which might imperil all that he had won by his successful advance. His gifted opponent, Memnon, after the loss of Halicarnassus, had proceeded to try the plan, which he had proposed at Zelea, of carrying the war over to Macedonia and Greece by means of the fleet. First, the island of Chios was betrayed to him, and then he turned to Lesbos, where he gained possession of all the cities except Mytilene. So he blockaded Mytilene by sea and land, and began the siege. The news caused great excitement in the Cyclades and in Hellas. Men talked of an attack by Memnon on Euboea, and not only in Sparta, but elsewhere there were great hopes of a change in the fortunes of war. But suddenly Memnon fell ill and died before Mytilene. His death at this moment was the greatest stroke of luck in Alexander's life, and no one recognized this more fully than Alexander. At the first news of the siege of Mytilene, he had been full of anxiety, and ordered Amphitorus and Hagelaus to collect a new fleet on the Hellespont. Both to them and to Antipater he forwarded large sums of money for military equipment. Then, probably before he left Gordium, the news of Memnon's death reached him, and he felt as it were relieved from a nightmare. It was also fortunate for him that Darius, on the news of Memnon's death, strangely abandoned Memnon's plan of an attack on Macedonia and Greece, ordered the mercenary troops of Pharnabazus, whom he had made commander of the fleet, to return to him, and determined under his personal command to offer battle and land to Alexander. Though the Persians had made further advances in the west after Memnon's death, had occupied Mytilene and Tenedos, and had compelled both to revoke their treaties with Alexander, and on the basis of the king's peace, to enter into an alliance again with the great king. Alexander could now, without anxiety, leave the recovery of the islands and the pacification of the west to his admirals and to Antipater. In the spring of 333, he left Gordium for Cappadocia by way of Ancyra, the present capital of Turkey, intending to turn southwards and with the greatest possible speed occupy the passes of Taurus. He traversed merely a small portion of Cappadocia, and as he appointed here not a Macedonian but a native, Sabictas, as satrap, the inference is that he had not the power to introduce a Macedonian regime, as he had done in the west. He had not time to conquer the whole country. It was only southern Cappadocia by Taurus that he nominally made a satrapy. Northern Cappadocia by Pontus, under its prince Ariathus, did not become subject to Alexander. It remained a gap in his Asiatic kingdom, and Armenia also remained independent. His advance was so rapid that Arsamas, the satrap of Cilicia, was completely taken by surprise. The extremely difficult pass which leads over the Taurus range was occupied without a blow, the guards running away, when on a dark night he climbed up with a few light-armed troops. Subsequently, on reaching the plain below, Alexander learned that the inhabitants of Tarsus, the capital, were afraid that Arsamas would sack their city before abandoning it to him. He galloped ahead with his cavalry, and Arsames at once fled without doing the city any damage. At Tarsus, the heroic career of Alexander well nigh came to a tragic end. On a hot summer's day he jumped into the icy waters of the Cydnus, which flows from the mountains through the town. He contracted a dangerous illness, and wrestled long with death in fevers and convulsions, encountering almost the same fate as the old Emperor Barbarossa, who met his end not far away in the Chalcidinas. Probably Alexander was saved more by his youth and iron constitution than by the medicines of his faithful Dr. Philip, but his expedition was long delayed by this illness, which was to have important after-effects. When he recovered, he dispatched Parmenio with a part of the army eastwards to forestall the occupation of the coast passes which led from Cilicia into Syria, and started off westwards himself to reduce the mountainous district of Cilicia Trachea, so as to complete the subjection of the coast as far as Lycia, and to cover his rear completely, before setting out to meet the great king. The rapid performance of this task in a few days showed that he had regained his former elasticity. On his way back at the old Greek coast town of Soloi, he received the news that his generals, whom he had left investing the citadels of Halicarnassus, had won a great victory. In honor of this victory, he celebrated a festival, and also in gratitude to the god Asclepius for his recovery. Beside a procession and a torch race, there were also gymnastic and musical competitions, mentioned here for the first time, and often afterwards. These were gymnastic exhibitions by the soldiers and artistic contests in which singers, musicians, and actors took part, who had perhaps been fetched from headquarters at Tarsus. After this, the main army began its march from Tarsus eastwards. When Alexander reached Mallus, he offered sacrifice to the hero prophet Amphilochus of Argos, who had here a famous oracle and was revered as founder of the town. At Mallus, too, he heard from Parmenio, who had in the meantime occupied the passes, that Darius with his army was encamped at Sokoi, a place unknown to us, in the plains of North Syria, 2 days' journey from the pass now called Belen. After Memnon's death, the great king, who had decided to take over the command in person and meet Alexander in a decisive battle, had collected a large army at Babylon. In the late summer of 333, being informed that Alexander was in Cilicia, he had gone up the Euphrates, accompanied by a huge baggage train, and then passed into the plain east of Mount Amanus to be ready. When Alexander emerged from the Belen Pass to offer battle at Sokoi, at a plain favorable to the deploying of his numerous army. Because of its numerical superiority, he was confident of victory, yet he had learned to estimate the fact that some time before, like a true sultan, he had instigated the Lycentian Alexander to murder him. As soon as the news about Sokoi reached Alexander at Mallus, he summoned a council of war to discuss what was to be done, and with their approval, set out to oppose the great king. But the battle was fought not on the other side of Mount Amanus at Sokoi, but on the side in the northwest corner of Syria south of Issus. How came this about? It is one of the most interesting and thrilling chapters in the whole history of the war. Alexander's road, which he had previously caused Parmenio to reconnoiter and occupy, led him through the Sicilian gate along the Syrian coast, which soon bends round southwards, past Issus, over the river Pinarus, Deletachai, and the smaller Payas, to the Syrian coast pass, and over the mountain pass by the Pillar of Jonah down to Mariandros, near the modern Alexandretta Escandaron. From here the road led southeastwards, over the Amanus, by the Baalan Pass to the Syrian plain. It was the road the younger Cyrus had once traveled over, and it was known to the Greeks from Xenophon's narrative. After leaving his sick and wounded at Issus, marching southwards, Alexander reached Maiandrios, where, on account of the violent autumn storms and the rainfall which had taken place in the night, he kept his troops in camp on the following day, probably also to give them a rest before the impending battle. There, in the evening, to his great surprise, he was informed by deserters that Darius and his army were north of him on the Panaras. He would scarcely believe it, and sent some officers by sea northwards to find out. They confirmed the news. How did this change of position occur? Darius had encamped for some weeks at Sukhoi, and there awaited his enemy's onward march from Cilicia. But Alexander's start was long delayed by his tedious illness and further events in Cilicia. Then, as day after day passed idly by, the great king lost all patience, and believing with his followers that Alexander was afraid and did not dare to advance, he determined to look for him in Cilicia. His contempt for the little army of Alexander, which he thought he could simply ride down with his masses of cavalry, together with regard for the approach of winter and difficulties of commissariat, upheld him in this plan. In order to make his gigantic army more mobile, he sent to Damascus the treasure and the main part of the baggage train, and with his army, still accompanied by a large train and his family, he marched east of Mount Amanus northwards to the Lion Pass, Arsalan Bogas, then southwest over the mountain through the gates of Amanus, Toprakalase, into the coast plain of Issus, to advance from there into Cilicia. If one compares the distances covered by the two armies and their different mobility, we may assume that Darius' start took place several days before Alexander left Melas, about the same time that Darius arrived at the gates of Amanus. Alexander reached Myandrius. Thus the two armies, separated by the range of Amanus, unsuspectingly marched past one another over different passes of the same mountain, with the result that Darius is now north and Alexander south. Darius was first apprised of this strange accident by coming on Alexander's wounded at Issus, who received shocking treatment from his troops, and he learned there that Alexander had just passed through, going southwards. He soon resolved to follow him and first encamped on the Panaras, evidently with the intention of following Alexander through the Balan Pass, and thus finally, according to the original plan, offering battle in the wide Syrian plains which were so favorable to him. It was fated to be otherwise. The moment that Alexander was informed of Darius' position on the Panaras, with the lightning intuition of genius, he perceived the great advantage given to him by this unexpected situation, and drew the necessary conclusions. He was cut off from his base of operations, and a defeat on the Panaras would have been catastrophic. But the absolute confidence of victory, which had hitherto led him on from one success to another, was no idle fancy, but was well founded on consciousness of his army's superior quality, and of his own talents for generalship. The only danger that could possibly threaten him from the vastly greater numbers of the enemy was that of being surrounded. But now this was, though not removed, yet greatly lessened. If he met the enemy, not in the broad Syrian plain, but in the plain of the Panaras, shut in by the mountains and the sea, quick action was necessary. So with the circumspection and calm which characterized him at the supreme moments of decision, he took all measures towards meeting the enemy on the following day. At once some cavalry and archers were dispatched to reconnoiter northwards as far as the top of the pass, the occupation of which was essential to his plan. After giving a quiet time to his troops to prepare a meal before moving off, he set out with the whole army, reached the summit of the pass by midnight, and having placed outposts made his men rest among the rocks. With the first rays of morning, he descended into the plain, first in a long narrow column, the infantry at the head, till the gradual expansion of the plain permitted the deployment of column of route into line of battle. Here again, as at the Granicus, the march to the field of battle was executed with as much calm and precision as if it had been on the parade ground, and not in front of the enemy. Thus the Panaras was the scene of one of the most memorable of battles, a duel with reversed fronts. We have good descriptions of it, for we can extract from later authors the accounts of two independent and primary sources, that of Berthélemy, who was himself one of the combatants, and that of Callisthenes, who, as a civilian, can have watched it only from a distance. The Panaras which in its upper and middle course had steep banks, was utilized by the Persians, like the Granicus, as an obstacle to defend their front. The mistakes of the satraps at the Granicus, moreover, were avoided on this occasion, the best troops, the Greek mercenaries, being placed in front of the center of the battle line. Right and left of them stood the Oriental hoplites, Kardaks, whose right wing was behind the cavalry, which Darius had thrown over the river to mask his operations, and afterwards withdrawn across it. The bulk of his cavalry was then posted on the right of the Greek mercenaries on the lower course of the river, where the banks were flat, and the stream hardly formed an obstacle, on ground suitable for a cavalry engagement and reaching right down to the sea. The remaining troops were drawn up in deep formation, behind this front and arrayed across the two nationalities. On the left wing by the slopes of Amanus, Darius had thrown forward a corps, which was, if possible, to take Alexander in the rear. He himself, in his magnificent chariot, was in the center behind the Greek mercenaries. Before the battle, Alexander secretly moved the Thessalian cavalry from the right wing behind the front to the left, making essentially the same disposition as at the Granicus. The only difference was that to meet the corps on the slopes, he placed some troops at right angles to his right wing. But as the corps fled to the hills before a rain of arrows, these troops were soon free to be brought back into the front. As at the Granicus, Alexander commanded the right, and Parmenio the left wing. The latter was given strict orders on no account to break contact with the sea. The importance of this position on the sea had been clear to Alexander the evening before at Maandros, when he first planned the battle. He had accordingly sacrificed to the gods of the sea, and in particular had driven a quadriga into the waves and offered it to Poseidon. He thus relied on the favor of the gods and his excellent cavalry under Parmenio. We must again reject the fantastic accounts of the Persian numbers, which have been stated to be as high as 600,000. But we cannot doubt that Alexander's army, though through accessions it was somewhat larger than his command at the Granicus, must have been faced by a large preponderance of force. Alexander opened the battle in accordance with the tactics of the oblique formation, by leading his heavy cavalry over the Panaris and charging the left wing of the enemy. Here, by his terrible onset, he soon made them waver, receiving himself a slight wound in the leg. In the meantime, however, the advancing regiments of his phalangites, in climbing the steep bank of the river, had become dislocated and had broken line. No sooner did the first-rate Greek mercenaries opposed to them notice this than they threw themselves into the gap, and a severe struggle began on the edge of the river. The fighting was all the more passionate, in that both Greeks and Macedonians were filled with the ambition of showing their superiority to their respective opponents. This strong antipathy then existing between the two peoples found expression in this engagement. But the hard-pressed Macedonians received assistance not only from the neighboring phalangites, but also from Alexander, who, after overcoming the left wing of the Persians, had executed the decisive turn, and was vehemently attacking the center. This decided the battle. As soon as Darius saw Alexander's impetuous onset, he turned his chariot and rushed northwards in wild flight. It is this moment that is represented after the dramatic exaggeration of Granicus in the famous Pompeian Mosaic from the Casa del Fauno. However much Alexander's heart was set on securing the person of the great king, he could not think of pursuing him. First, the battle against the Greek mercenaries, and above all, the cavalry engagement on the left wing had to be decided. On the left at the outset, the numerically superior Persian cavalry had crossed the Panaris, and fiercely attacked the Thessalian and Peloponnesian horse under Parmenio, who were soon in serious difficulties. It was all important that there should be no breach in the line here, because in that case Alexander's position might have been turned. The events of the battle, both in the center and by the sea, show how much more dangerous to Alexander the battle of Issus was than that of the Granicus. The cavalry engagement was conducted on both sides with the greatest fury, till the Persian cavalry heard that their king had fled and left them in the lurch. Then they wheeled round their horses in flight, and, pursued by the Thessalians, became entangled in the rout which was becoming a universal throughout the whole Persian army. As soon as the Persians turned to flee, Alexander took up the pursuit in the hopes of still catching Darius. But the latter had quickly exchanged his chariot for a horse, had thrown off his royal cloak, and escaped, leaving his shield and bow behind. The pursuit must have inflicted huge losses on the Persians, for north of the battlefield, Amanus soon approaches the sea, and leaves only a narrow passage, through which the fleeing masses had to press. But Ptolemy, who rode beside Alexander, tells us that in the pursuit they rode over a ravine, which was filled to the top with the corpses of the enemy. When darkness fell, Alexander broke off the pursuit and returned to the Panaris. Here the royal camp, with all its oriental luxury, fell into the hands of the victor. His most valuable booty was the royal family, the mother and wife of Darius, with her 3 children, who as hostages might be of the greatest use. That same night, when they were lamenting over Darius as dead, Alexander caused them to be informed that he was alive. It was not mere diplomatic calculation, which made him treat these women with the honors due to queens. For after the death of Darius, he behaved in the same manner to the mother who survived him, when such conduct could no longer serve any purpose. Rather, we observe here the chivalry, which was a typical trait of Alexander's character. He went so far in his respectful treatment that he did not even see the royal consort Stateria, who was counted as the most beautiful woman of Asia. Thus, at the beginning of November 333, the gigantic army of the great king was beaten and disintegrated, and he himself a fugitive. Only 8,000 Greek mercenaries had escaped in good order over the mountains. The sensation caused by the news through the whole Greek world was immense. There the decision had been awaited with feverish excitement. All the hostile and turbulent elements hoped for a Persian victory, and no one more than Demosthenes, who, on receipt of letters from the east, went triumphantly round Athens, proclaiming that Alexander was caught off in Sicilia and would soon be trodden down by the Persian cavalry. Those who were friendly to the Macedonians were in the deepest anxiety. Then the news of Alexander's brilliant victory came like a thunderbolt, causing rejoicing here and dejection there. The feelings of the deputies of the Sanhedrion of the Corinthian League must have been very mixed, when at the next regular meeting for the Isthmian Games of 332, they resolved to send Alexander a golden wreath by an embassy, to congratulate him on his victory, and to thank him for what he had done for the salvation and freedom of Hellas. The news of the victory was crushing to the Persian admirals and the Aegean. All prospect of cooperation with the Greeks was gone forever. They had just entered into conference with Agis, the Spartan king, at the island of Sphnos, when the tidings arrived, and they broke up at once. Pharnabazus hurrying to Chios to prevent it going over to the victor on hearing the news. Agis, nevertheless, did not relinquish his plan of carrying on the war, but borrowed 30 talents and 10 triremes from the Persians in order to win Crete for his cause. The victory at Issus produced a great change in Alexander himself. While after the battle of the Granicus he had strongly emphasized his hegemony of the Hellenic League, he now publicly appeared for the first time as claimant to the lordship over the whole Persian Empire. We cannot know whether this great ambition was not present to his mind before. We can only guess that possibly the oracle of Gordian, which had promised him the sovereignty of Asia, made the thought more definite, and probably the intention did not become fully clear until at Issus he had defeated the great king in person. Alexander was not slow to give it expression. He did so in a letter, which he wrote to Darius soon after the battle, in reply to Darius's request for the surrender of his family, and to his offer of friendship and alliance. This letter, which Arrian gives us in an essentially authentic form, is one of the most interesting documents bearing on Alexander's life. In the opening, he declares that, having been appointed hegemon of the Greeks, he has invaded Asia to take vengeance for the evil wrought by Darius's forefathers to Macedonia and the rest of Greece. He then recounts to him the hostile acts which Ochus and then Darius had committed against Philip and himself. As now, after the victories of Granicus and Issus, by the grace of the gods he possesses the land, and is lord of all Asia. Let Darius come to him, and receive his family. In future Darius must write to him as king of Asia, not as his equal. If he objects, let him fight, and not flee. He will catch him wherever he is. The history of the following years demonstrates that it was, as a matter of fact, premature for Alexander already to regard himself as lord of all Asia. He had to fight another dangerous battle for its possession. But to comprehend his gifted nature, it is significant to learn that already, under the impression of the victory of Issus, and in full confidence that he would conquer, wherever it might be, he now claimed all Asia, and it is the Persian world empire, and at any rate for the great king's correspondence, demand the title of King of Asia. In spite of this, afterwards, as before, he regarded himself as hegemon of the League, as the history of the following year shows, a title which he expressly asserted in the opening of the letter. The double nature of his aims is clearly indicated. In itself it must have appeared tempting to Alexander after the victory to pursue the fleeing king, and so take possession of the Asiatic empire, but the Persian fleet still controlled the sea, and the further Alexander penetrated from the coast, the greater would have been the peril of this fleet rousing Greece once more to revolt. King Agus of Sparta had by no means abandoned his design. Again, one must admire the prudence of the young king, who resisted the enticing prospect of entering without much trouble the royal palaces of the Achaemenids, and adhered to his old strategic plan, first to subdue the Mediterranean coast of the Persian Empire, to deprive the fleet of its bases, and so completely to secure his rear against Greece. From this point of view, it was a military necessity first to occupy the Syrian coast. Accordingly, from Issus he marched south with the main army to occupy the cities of the coast, while he sent Parmenio to Damascus to seize the town and take possession of the treasure sent there by Darius. At Damascus, which was surrendered by treachery, the military chest of the Persian king fell into the hands of the victor. This was an event of the greatest importance. The financial anxieties which had hitherto sorely oppressed him, now ceased, along with many other captives, ambassadors from Athens, Sparta, and Thebes, who had reached the great king just before the battle of Issus, and therefore had been dispatched during the Pan-Hellenic campaign, also fell into his hands. Instead of treating them as traitors, Alexander displayed surprising leniency and generosity to them. In Asia Minor, apart from the Greek colonists, he had to do only with people of the old indigenous races or with Indo-Germanic tribes of later arrival like the Phrygians. Now he entered for the first time the Semitic world, in Syria where settled the most varied stocks, who had come in from Arabia centuries before, partly in the Canaanite and partly in the latter Aramaic migration, and had developed distinct mixed cultures, influenced in the north by Babylonia and the Hittites, in the south by Egypt. There were no Greek colonies here, for at the period of Greek colonization the Assyrian Empire had made it impossible for Greeks to settle on this coast. Alexander's first object was to occupy the Phoenician towns, since the Phoenician ships with their first-rate crews, along with the Cyprians, constituted the best part of the Persian fleet. These prosperous commercial cities of the Phoenicians, each under a king, formed little independent states, among which Sidon and Tyre for ages had struggled with varying success for the hegemony. Some years before, under the lead of Sidon, Phoenicia had rebelled, but King Ochus had finally reduced them to obedience, and Sidon had been destroyed in 350, but had soon recovered again. At this time, Tyre was the leading city. The northern towns, Aradus, Babylus, and Sidon, opened their gates immediately to Alexander. But at Tyre he was to meet with stubborn resistance. The local god at Tyre was Melkarth, identified by the Greeks long before, as Herodotus tells us, with their Heracles. Nothing was more natural than that Alexander should wish to sacrifice to Heracles, the ancestor of his house, in Tyre as elsewhere. But he did not suspect what it meant to the Tyrians when he expressed to their ambassadors the desire to sacrifice in person in the old temple of Heracles in the island city of Tyre. He did not know that according to Oriental ideas, that the Tyrians would have acknowledged him as king of their city by granting this request, for only the king was allowed to offer sacrifice. When the Tyrians, without explaining this, replied that they would grant him anything else but not this sacrifice, and, probably trusting to the often proved impregnability of their city, declared that they would receive neither Persians nor Macedonians within their walls, and also desired to remain neutral. Alexander could see nothing but contumaciousness in their answer, and determined to take the city by storm, for he could not possibly in his march to Egypt leave this capital of the Phoenician world unsubdued in his rear. About January 332, he began the siege. The conquest on which he had set his heart was more difficult than he supposed. Tyre was on an island, separated from old Tyre by a narrow arm of the sea, defended on all sides by strong walls and also by the fleet. Alexander saw immediately that this insular position must be abolished by the construction of a mole from old Tyre to the island, in order that his siege engines might be brought up to the walls. In spite of extraordinary exertions, it was a slow business to push the causeway forward in face of the clever counter-maneuvers of the enemy. The Tyrians destroyed the first fortifications on the causeway by a fire ship, but Alexander began at once to construct a fresh mole of greater breadth. Experience showed him that he was opposed to the traditional Oriental engineering, from which his father's siegecraft, taken over from Dionysus, was the latest offshoot, for the engineers of Dionysus had been taught by the Carthaginians, who had derived their skill from the Phoenician motherland. In these arts of siege and defense the early Oriental peoples were, as the Assyrian reliefs make plain, far superior to the Greeks. Indeed, they were their teachers. When the fleets of the northern Phoenician towns left the Persian fleet and returned at the news of the occupation of their homes, and when soon afterwards the Cypriot contingent did the same, Alexander went to Sidon, united the two fleets that had hitherto been operating against him, and took them to Tyre, in order to invest the city from the sea. His strategic idea of cutting the Persian fleet off from the coast had brilliantly justified itself. He now posted the Cypriot fleet before the northern or Sidonian harbor of Tyre, and the Phoenician ships before the southern or Egyptian harbor. All hope of relief to the besieged was thus cut off, but in spite of that, they continued to defend themselves with great bravery. A sally of the Tyrian fleet northwards against the Cypriots ended in their total defeat. On the completion of the mole, it appeared that Alexander's engines had not the desired effect on the strong eastern walls, but the ships that were armed with siege engines, after repeated attempts, finally succeeded in making a breach in the southern wall, and laid the city open to storm. Simultaneously, the fleets pressed into the harbors. After a short bloody struggle, the city was in Alexander's hands. Quarter was given only to those who, like King Azemolkos and the Carthaginian ambassadors, had taken refuge in the temple of Melkarth. About 8,000 Tyrians fell, and about 30,000 were sold as slaves according to the customs of Greek warfare. The city was spared and resettled, and placed under Macedonian commandment to become the chief stronghold of Macedonian power on this coast. Alexander could now make his sacrifice to Heracles. It was combined with a solemn procession of the army in full equipment, as at Ephesus, but on this occasion the personnel of the fleet joined in the parade, and the gymnastic competition and the torch race were held in the temple precincts. The engine which had made the breach was dedicated to the god in the temple. Tyre fell in August 332. The population, which had held out so long in a desperate case, deserve admiration and sympathy, but the victor claims our admiration too. Alexander had been 7 months before the city. He did not leave it till he had carried out what he regarded as absolutely essential. While Alexander was besieging Tyre, a second and last letter reached him from Darius. In it he offered, along with a large ransom for his family, 10,000 talents, the hand of his daughter, a treaty of friendship and alliance, and the surrender of his empire west of the Euphrates. It was a fateful moment for the ancient empire. If Alexander had been satisfied with the empire up to the Euphrates, the whole subsequent evolution of ancient civilization would have been totally different. The after effects of his decision, indeed, stretched through the Middle Ages down to our own day, in the East as in the West, for Alexander, who at least since Isis claimed the whole Asiatic empire, to refuse was a matter of course. Our authorities tell us that in the council of the Heteroi, before whom Alexander laid the letter, Parmenio said that if he were Alexander, he would be satisfied with it and end the war, whereupon Alexander answered, "And I too, if I were Parmenio." There is a deep meaning in this potential anecdote. Two different generations face each other in the old general and the young king, and one might quite well replace the general by his master Philip, for herein lies the contrast between the policies of Philip and Alexander. We may state with confidence that if Philip had ever advanced so far, he would certainly have accepted the offer of the Euphrates frontier. Philip always remained a Macedonian, and would have done so if he had incorporated parts of the Persian Empire in his Macedonian Empire. Alexander, who already felt himself king of Asia, was in a course of development which was bound to lead him far beyond Macedonian interests. That for the Macedonian people, Philip's more limited policy would have been the better, can scarcely be doubted. Nor can one dispute the fact that by being limited to the Euphrates frontier, Greek culture in the Nearer East might have been diffused in a more intensive and permanent fashion. But there never could have been that worldwide culture, whose effects can be traced to India and even to China. Would not, too, a strong Persian power beyond the Euphrates have been a permanent danger to the Hellenized Nearer East? It is scarcely possible to weigh what might have happened against what actually did happen. At any rate, we see here most clearly what a decisive effect the will of Alexander had on the subsequent history of the world. When Alexander marched southwards from Tyre, he met with resistance at one place only, the old Philistine city of Casa, the last great coastal town before the Egyptian frontier, a strong fortress on an eminence, which was bravely and skillfully defended by the eunuch Battus, with the help of Nabatean mercenaries. Not until the heavy siege engines had been fetched from Tyre and placed upon an artificial rampart, and the walls had been undermined, did he succeed in taking the city after a 2 months' siege. In the course of it he was wounded by a shot in the shoulder, as a clean sweep had been made of the population partly by death and partly by enslavement. Alexander fetched in new settlers from the neighborhood and converted the town into a Macedonian fortress. From Gaza he marched along the coast, and in 7 days reached Pelusium, the frontier fortress of Egypt, where he found his fleet. It was a necessary part of a strategic plan to occupy Egypt before he penetrated into the interior of Asia, though the principal danger, which had threatened him from the Persian fleet, was now removed. King Agis of Sparta was still active in stirring up war against him. An unoccupied Persian Egypt in his rear might also have been a rallying point or an asylum for all turbulent and hostile elements, and just before his arrival, Amyntas, son of Antiochus, who had escaped from the battlefield of Issus with those 8,000 Greek mercenaries, had attempted, though without success, to establish himself there. Egypt fell to Alexander without fighting. Mazakis, the satrap, surrendered to him the citadel of Memphis, with the garrison and the treasury, 800 talents, and the Egyptian people hailed him with joy as their deliverers from the Persian yoke. For more than 60 years they had succeeded, by prudently taking advantage of the disorders in the Persian Empire, and by the help of large Greek mercenary armies and prominent Greek commanders such as Chabrias, Agesilaus, and others, in maintaining under their national pharaohs their freedom from the Persian rule, which had begun with Cambyses. But 10 years previously, Ochus had reconquered Egypt, expelled the last native king, Netanbibo II, and dealt a deadly blow to the Egyptian people, in nothing so sensitive as in their religious life, by inaugurating the new Persian rule, with the plundering of Egyptian temples. Hence the hatred of Persian government, and the joy and hope with which Alexander was received, nor were they destined to be disappointed by him. Alexander was a true Hellen in his complete toleration for the gods of the foreign peoples whom he encountered. Very early the Greeks began to identify foreign divinities with corresponding Greek gods. In Egypt, in particular, the principal gods of the Egyptians had been equated with Greek gods by the Greek residents, Ammon with Zeus, Osiris with Dionysus, Isis with Demeter, Horus with Apollo, and so forth. To Alexander it was quite natural to testify his reverence towards the Egyptian gods. But it became his special duty and obligation when, probably soon after his entry into Memphis, he was recognized by the Egyptian priesthood as king of Egypt, and therewith acquired the right of offering the royal sacrifices which played so great a part in that country. This extremely important event is not mentioned in our historical sources. But the Alexander romance states that at Memphis, Alexander was placed on a throne in the temple Epate and invested as king of Egypt. Suspicious as this authority is in itself, the idea at least might be accepted as historical, for the adoption of the royal state must have found expression in some official act. However that may be, hieroglyphic texts at any rate testify that Alexander bore the traditional royal titles, like his Persian and Egyptian predecessors, of the 5 titles customary from the middle of the 3rd millennium B.C. The 1st, 4th, and 5th, we learn from inscriptions, were given to Alexander as Horus. He was called the Strong Prince, also with the addition, he hath laid hands on the lands of the foreigners, or the protection of Egypt, as King of Upper Egypt and King of Lower Egypt. He was called Beloved of Ammon and Selected of Ra, and finally as Son of Ra. He was called Alexandros. Here the Horus title, He who hath laid hands on the lands of the foreigners, seems to have been invented for Alexander, whereas the other terms are frequently found before his time. These titles prove 2 things of Alexander: his special sovereignty over Egypt and his consequent deification. Probably the new Horus title points to his power outside Egypt, or according to Egyptian notions, to his worldwide sovereignty. But the emphasis lies on King of Upper and Lower Egypt, by which he is specially claimed as king of the Egyptian country. These inscriptions establish that Alexander accepted the throne offered to him by the priests, perhaps the high priest of Memphis. His whole behavior in Egypt is therefore to be judged from this point of view. To the Egyptians, Alexander was thus their special king, who by personal union joined Egypt to his other realms, as Charlemagne brought the Lombards into his empire by becoming their king. Previously he had neither in Lydia nor anywhere else thought of assuming a separate position, and later we shall find this happening only once again, at Babylon. These 2 states of ancient civilization on the Nile and Euphrates, which for millennia had been the spiritual leaders of the East, and thus a special standing conceded to them in the empire of Alexander. It was primeval traditions that demanded this solution. From the earliest times, divinity had been bound up with Egyptian sovereignty, for the pharaoh was regarded as the incarnation of the greatest god. In the above titles, divinity is expressly ascribed to Alexander, and in 3 grades. As Horus he was god, as son of Ra he was son of God, a title used from the 5th dynasty onwards, signifying that the holder was mystically begotten by Ra with the queen mother. Finally, he was a favorite of the gods, as beloved of Ammon, selected of Ra, both high-flown phrases, applied already to earlier kings. Egypt was at that time the only country in the East in which monarchy and divinity were inseparable, and so to a people of about 7 million, Alexander became the recipient of divine honors. But to Alexander, this Egyptian apotheosis had a purely local significance. Outside Egypt, no effects of it can be traced. It is stated that Alexander sacrificed to the other gods, and also to Apis, who was not a god but a sacred animal, belonging to the cult of Ptah. We do not know whether he did this before or after the assumption of the state of a pharaoh. Perhaps the sacrifice to Apis was the first royal sacrifice, which followed his enthronement in the temple of Ptah. The sacrifice to Apis was bound to make a profound impression on the Egyptians. Nothing had enraged them so much as the slaying of the sacred bull, first by Cambyses and then by Ochus. From the earliest times the cult of Apis had not been merely local, but one of those that were celebrated everywhere. In taking this step, Alexander therefore had the political object of setting himself in diametrical opposition to these wicked Persians. Scanty and casual as is the Egyptian information that has come to us from the time of Alexander, we have evidence that he performed his religious obligations to the country as pharaoh. He ordered the rebuilding both of the sanctuary in the temple of Thothmes III at Karnak, and that of the temple of Amenhotep III at Luxor. But Alexander had not come merely to promote the continuance of Egyptian culture. His desire was here, as in the case of his previous conquest, to pave the way for Greek culture. Egypt was no unknown land to the Greeks. Since the 7th century, numerous Greeks had entered as mercenaries the service of Egyptian rulers, and some of them had settled in the country. From the reign of Psammetichus I, also there had been on the Canopic arm of the Nile, in the delta, a real Greek polis, Naucratis, rediscovered near the present Nabera, in which, more particularly, after the reorganization of the kingdom by Amasis, Greco-Egyptian trade had been concentrated. Even in the capital city of Memphis, there was a Greek community, Politimao, the so-called Hellenomaphites, the descendants of those Ionian mercenaries who had helped Psammetichus to found his dynasty, while the Naucratites were legally debarred from marrying native wives and had kept the race pure. In this community of Memphis, where the prohibition obviously did not exist, mixed marriages had taken place, and yet there, as at Naucratis, these Greeks were united in the Hellenic union for common Greek worship and life. Evidence has come down to us of their cultural life in the 2 oldest papyri we possess, which are approximately of Alexander's time. The one, the Persia, of the poet and musician Timotheus, testifies to the cultivation of Greek literature, while the cursing of Artemisia before Osiris, the god of the Serapeum, reveals a blend of Greek and Egyptian culture. How these Hellenomaphites must have rejoiced when Alexander entered the city. They might well hope that a new era of Greek influence in Egypt was to begin. They were to be as little disappointed in their hopes as the Egyptians in theirs. Alexander knew precisely how both to satisfy the Egyptians, especially in their religious requirements, and to strengthen Greek influence in Egypt. At his first entry into Memphis, he expressed this double program in symbolic fashion. After the sacrifice to Apis, he held there, in the center of Egypt, for the first time since the erection of the pyramids, a gymnastic and musical competition, to which the most famous artistes from Greece were summoned. One must not conclude that Alexander wanted to introduce these Greek games into the cult of the Egyptian gods, or even to that of the Apis bull, and in this manner inaugurate a policy of blending of the 2 separate civilizations. He never aimed at a mixture of Greek and Egyptian culture. On the contrary, he placed by the side of the Egyptian cult the Greek games as something different in kind and purely Greek, in order to affirm his program from the very first, that, without prejudice to the Egyptian cult, Greek ways of life, Greek gymnastics, Greek arts, and literature in honor of Greek gods should in future have a home in Egypt. The greatest contribution Alexander made towards the inclusion of Egypt in the Greek world was the foundation of Alexandria. As 332 was ending and 331 beginning, he started from Memphis, attended only by a small division of troops, the light Hypaetists, the archers, and Agranians, and the royal squadron of Heteroi. Proceeding down the western arm of the Nile as far as Canopus, he turned to the left, and on the strip of ground between the inland lake, Mareotis, and the island of Pharos, laid out the town which to this day bears his name. It was the first new foundation that Alexander established on his march, for the assumption that he had previously founded Alexandria by Isis. Alexandretta is a disputed point. Not to the interior of Asia was reached shall we find further foundations of cities. There he founded many. The object of this foundation on the Egyptian coast cannot be doubtful. It can hardly have been a military one, since, to keep Egypt under control, forces should be concentrated not on the coast, but in or near Memphis. It is expressly stated that Alexander transferred to Alexandria the emporium of the neighboring Canopus. Alexandria was to be a staple and trade center, and for such no better site could have been found on the whole coast. Whether Alexander himself or one of his followers made the choice, it was a stroke of genius. The determining factor may have lain in these circumstances. The island of Pharos in front provided a sheltered harbor from the sea, while Lake Mareotis behind afforded an inner harbor, in particular the only one on the coast unthreatened by the masses of silt brought down by the Nile. The sea current, which here sets from west to east, has in the course of time silted up all the harbors on the Egyptian and South Syrian coast. Alexandria is the only exception because it lies west of the westernmost arm. It is possible that one of the scientific men who attended Alexander knew of this current. Thus it was Alexander who first gave to Egypt a port with a future, though the history of the country reaches back for millennia before him. Naucratis had hitherto been the center of trade between Egypt and the Aegean, but it lay in the interior of the delta, and could not be as effective as a great Greek commercial city on the coast, such as Alexander now planned. No doubt he was all the more eager in this project, because during his stay in Egypt he was impressed by the rich productivity of the country, and the enormous potentialities of its export trade. His design of occupying first the Mediterranean coast of the Persian Empire, however exclusively dictated by strategic considerations, had succeeded, and by the foundation of Alexandria he showed his intention of turning the military result to an economic use. The commercial area of the Levant, with its coasts and islands, was under his control, but the finishing touch was still lacking in the south. He now supplied it. Later on, under Ptolemies, the commercial importance of Alexandria was carried to a far higher pitch, but it is not improbable, as we shall see, that Alexander's final plans also connected Alexandria with even more ample schemes. At any rate, down to the foundation of Constantinople, no city was founded which had such worldwide importance as Alexandria in Egypt. The new city, like its latter developments, had side by side with it an already existing settlement, a little fishing village called Rakotis. The plans for the city, which adjoined Rakotis on the east, were drawn up by Dinocrates of Rhodes on the lines of the pattern then in fashion, which had been introduced in the 5th century by Hippodamus of Miletus. 2 broad streets intersecting each other at right angles were laid out, and the remaining narrower streets drawn parallel to them, so that the whole consisted of square or rectangular blocks of houses. Alexander was passionately interested in the work. He was again seized by a longing, and himself indicated where the marketplace and temples were to be, and decided what gods should have their temples in the new foundation. In accordance with his tolerant policy, and as a gracious pharaoh, he also granted the Egyptians in Rakotis an Egyptian temple, dedicated to Isis and certainly also to Osiris and Horus. The new city was, as usual, surrounded by a wall. It is described thus in a hieroglyphic document of 311. The fortress of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, beloved of Ammon and selected of Ra, son of Ra. Alexandros, on the shore of the great sea of the Ionians. Rakotis was its earlier name. One can imagine how many Greek architects, craftsmen, and artists of the most different kinds were attracted to Egypt by the opportunities afforded in the building of Alexandria. This will explain the evident influence, even in Alexander's lifetime, of Greek art on Egyptian. The course of history caused Alexandria to take on more and more of an international character. Besides the Egyptians of Rakotis at the beginning, many non-Greeks, Jews, and other foreigners were attracted by the tempting profits and pleasures of the great city. But we must not fail to recognize that Alexander founded the city which he placed by the side of Rakotis as a purely Greek polis, with its council, boale, and a popular assembly. While Alexander was still on the coast, his admiral Hemjamalokos arrived with the joyful news that his fleet once more controlled the Aegean, and that after the breakup of the Persian fleet, Tenedos, Lesbos, Chios, and Kos had all been recaptured. He now took a decision, which may give us an insight into his relation at the time to the Corinthian League. About a year before, in a document preserved to us, he had determined, according to the arrangements in force with regard to Chios, then under siege, that the traitors, when captured, should be brought before the Sanhedrion as the regular tribunal of the League, as it was to the Synhedrion that he had formerly referred the punishment of the Thebans. Notwithstanding, when Hegeliacus brought before him the captive traitors of Chios, he did not send them to the Synhedrion, but in the exercise of his own authority commanded that, by way of punishment, they should be transferred to Elephantine, the most southerly city of Egypt above the first cataract. This justifies the conclusion that in the interval he had won a more independent position with reference to the Hellenic League, so that he now denied to the Synhedrion a right which he had expressly recognized to it a year before. If we inquire into the psychological basis of such a change, the conjecture suggests itself that his great success in the interval, the occupation of Syria and Egypt, the dissolution of the Persian fleet, and recovery of the control of the sea, must have largely increased his feeling of power. Perhaps, too, it did not fail to impress the king, who was only 24 years old, that to these many millions of Egyptians he had become a god. In this state of intense feeling, which drew his thoughts to the future, he was seized, while still on the coast, with the idea of consulting the oracle in the oasis of Ammon. This mysterious excursion to the oracle of Ammon in the oasis of Siwa is one of the most remarkable episodes in Alexander's life. In its varied panorama, hardly anything has so much appealed to the imagination of contemporaries, later generations and moderns, as this romantic march through the desert, when one considers that it was Alexander's interest as soon as possible to meet Darius, of whose fresh and gigantic military preparations he was doubtfully fully apprised. It is clear that it must have been a strong motive that induced him to undertake this digression to the west, a digression completely useless and rather dangerous from the military standpoint, which removed him for 6 weeks from his Egyptian base. It is one of those actions of Alexander's which are only intelligible if we take into account his religious inner life, and the non-rational and unaccountable elements in his character. Arrian again employs the same expression. The longing seized him to consult the oracle of Ammon. It was, in fact, a need which he felt in his inmost soul to hear the oracle about his future before the decisive encounter with Darius. To understand this, one must remember that Alexander was a son of his age, and attached the greatest importance to oracles and divine omens generally, whether they were manifested in dreams, in the flight of birds, or otherwise in the process of nature. But why did he go to Ammon in particular? It has nothing to do with his position as pharaoh. No pharaoh had ever made a pilgrimage to the oasis. He was not paying any regard to his Egyptian subjects when he did this. If he merely wanted to hear an Egyptian oracle, there were many oracular gods in Egypt that he might have consulted. His pilgrimage to Ammon may have produced a specially favorable impression upon the Egyptians, because thereby, as in the case of the offerings to Apis, he appeared as the reverence of the evil Cambyses. The story was told how Cambyses once sent out an expedition to destroy the oracle, but it was annihilated by sandstorms. Yet Alexander would never have undertaken the journey simply to make an anti-Persian demonstration. It was as a Greek that he visited the god, because his oracle was then regarded as infallible in the Greek world. The Greek colonists of the neighboring town of Cyrene had, at an early period, formed trade relations with this oasis, which was exceptionally rich in date palms. They were the first to equate with their own Zeus this Ammon, who was an offshoot of the Ammon of Thebes in Upper Egypt, and the first to place on their coins the type of Zeus with the ram horns of Ammon curved about the ears. From Cyrene, the knowledge of the oracle spread throughout the Greek world. Pindar wrote a hymn to the god, and later evidence of the growing estimation of the oracle becomes abundant. It was consulted by Cimon, Lysander, and others. It is named in the birds of Aristophanes, along with Delphi and Dodona, and constantly it takes a higher rank. Shortly before Alexander's visit, also the Athenians, and constructed in Athens a sanctuary of Ammon, who had been worshipped by them for decades already. So we understand how Alexander, if he felt the need of an infallible answer, used this opportunity of his stay on the coast of Egypt, where he was comparatively near to the god, to consult his oracle. It is possible that alongside of this leading motive, which is stated in our authorities, he contemplated with satisfaction the effect of a favorable oracle on the Greeks, in view of the great importance then attached by them to the oracle. A religious sanction might certainly be given in their eyes to his great enterprise. Callisthenes, his court historian, who accompanied him on the journey into the desert, and gave an excellent description of it, tells us that Alexander went to Ammon, not only on account of the reputed infallibility of his oracle, but also because he had the ambition to rival Perseus and Heracles, who had likewise formerly consulted the god. If one considers how vividly Alexander conceived his relations to the heroic ancestors of his race, this statement is quite credible, and suits the picture we have to form of him. He may have given out this motive in an official proclamation to his friends and the troops accompanying him, in order to kindle their zeal to endure the impending fatigues of the desert march. As he marched westwards from Rakotis along the coast, he was met by ambassadors from Cyrene, who conveyed to him the homage of the city. They brought costly presents, and invited him to visit Cyrene and its dependent towns. Our authorities merely state briefly that Alexander made alliance and friendship with the Cyrenians. We can imagine how pleased he was with this unexpected recognition of his power, and how the eye of the conqueror involuntarily turned westward, where, with the Cyrenic districts added, his sphere of interest extended to the Syrtes and to the frontiers of the Carthaginian Empire. On reaching Paratonium, he turned southwest onto the old caravan road, which at present brings one to the oasis after a march of about 12 days. Here his Macedonians were to become acquainted for the first time with the toils and dangers of traveling in the desert. As formerly on the Pamphylian coast the retirement of the sea had been attributed to the direct intervention of the godhead, so now divine protection was credited with the rain, which suddenly fell when the provision of water, carried in skins on camels' backs, had given out. Some days later a southern sandstorm, a simum, obliterated the road with masses of sand, and the guides announced that 2 ravens were cawing and flying ahead of the party. Alexander gave orders that the ravens were to be followed, relying on the god, who had sent the birds to show them the way in token of his gracious reception of the visit. These tales have been regarded as literary embellishments or inventions of Callisthenes, yet one sees in them only the heightened religious feeling of the pilgrims, roused by the unwonted terrors of the desert and the imminent danger of death, which thus transformed natural occurrences into supernatural miracles. When Alexander and his party at last reached the oasis of Siwa, they were astonished at the wonderful forest of date palms and olives, and the wealth of water in numerous springs and lakes. The oracular temple to which he repaired was on the citadel now called Aguremi. The remains of the temple today are so built over by modern houses that it planned cannot be restored with certainty. What is preserved is the portal of the front colonnade, crowned by an Egyptian chamfer, which led into the priest temple behind the courtyard, and also parts of the innermost sanctuary, the walls of which were decorated with reliefs and hieroglyphic inscriptions. Callisthenes prefaces his narrative of Alexander's visit with the description of the usual ritual and the giving of oracular responses. This is thoroughly confirmed by the agreement of essential features with the ritual of the Ammon temple at Thebes, of which the temple in the oasis was a branch. According to Callisthenes, the answer was not given in words, as at Delphi and Branchadei, but the god, whose idol in the form of Omphalos was for the purpose carried round the temple courtyard in his boat on the shoulders of the priests in solemn procession, and the accompaniment of the singing of maidens and matrons, indicated his will through the idol, which directed the priestly bearers where to turn their steps by nods and signs, which were the interpretations of the shaking and movements caused by carrying, and the chief priest, as the prophet, explained these signs as consent or refusal, for which no doubt there were primitive traditions, shaped the oracle in accordance with them, and then announced it to the consultant. One can imagine that the excitement of the priest was like that of a disturbed ant-hill, when from the height of Al-Gurmi they saw in the distance the great caravan advancing with glistening weapons, and the news went round that the new king of Egypt was arriving in person. For never before, as was stated, had a pharaoh revisited the oasis. Preparations for a solemn reception had to be made in all haste. Some priests were forthwith dispatched to receive the king and his escort outside the gate, and to acquaint them with the traditional ceremonial before they entered the temple. In view of the constant intercourse with Greek pilgrims, it may be assumed for certain that in this great body of priests there were people enough who could speak Greek. Accordingly, the announcement was made to the visitors that only Alexander as pharaoh might enter, and without change of clothes, the temple of the priest, which enclosed the portico and holy of holies, whereas his followers might enter only the court in front, the temple of the layfolk, after making certain changes of clothing prescribed by ceremonial. Meanwhile, it appears, the prophet, a venerable old man, had arranged that the idol in his boat should be carried by the priest out of the Holy of Holies into the temple court to greet the king of Egypt as early as possible, and he himself awaited the king's arrival there. When Alexander with his suite, conducted by the priest sent out to meet him, entered the temple court, the prophet went to receive him, and, addressing him according to Egyptian ceremonial but certainly in the Greek language, greeted him as son of Ammon, in the name of the god. He then led the king alone into the temple of the priest, where Alexander put his question to the oracle in the Holy of Holies. When Alexander returned into the temple court, and his friends eagerly asked what had happened, he said nothing more than that he had heard what was according to his wish. Some of his friends also used the opportunity to put questions to the god on their own behalf. They too received answers, according to the rite described. By the mediation of the prophet, but outside in the temple court, like ordinary pilgrims, this was what happened in public. As the answer of Alexander to his friends shows, he kept the oracle to himself and treated it as secret. He might have had his own reasons for doing so, but it might also have been indicated to him by the prophet that the answer was to be kept secret, according to Egyptian ideas, because the god had spoken to his son. At any rate, Alexander kept the secret, for he wrote to his mother Olympia soon afterwards that he had received secret directions, which he would impart to her alone after his return to Macedonia. As this never happened, Alexander took the secret with him to the grave. So we shall never know what question he asked. The existing military and political situation makes it more than probable that the question referred in some way to his future. But how he formulated it, and how far forward it extended, whether it concerned only the impending struggle with Darius, or the actual winning of the sovereignty over Asia, which he had claimed after Issus, or whether ideas going far beyond that of actual worldwide rule were already in his mind, as they appeared without disguise in the latter years of his life, Ammon alone knew, and we shall never know. By those words of Alexander to his friends, the public doubtless learned that he had received a favorable answer from the god, and the Greek world, which believed the infallibility of Zeus Ammon, might now perhaps acknowledge that what Alexander did henceforth was done with the consent and blessing of the god. But even if this was the effect, it fell far short of the impression that the previous salutation of Alexander as son of Zeus Ammon was bound to make. To the prophet, this salutation had been a matter of course, because he had before him the king of Egypt. From the Egyptian point of view, it was simply a consequence of the recognition that Alexander was also king of the Oasis. Alexander may already have been saluted in the temple of Ptah at Memphis or in other Egyptian temples, which he entered, as son of the particular god in question, but whether these salutations made any profound impression on Alexander, whether indeed his attention was especially called to these titles, which were wrapped up in traditional phrases and certainly given in Egyptian, whether their meaning was explained to him, is more than doubtful. Here in the Oasis, however, this salutation of him as son of the god, which came to him as a complete surprise, could not but make the deepest impression upon him. The god he regarded as Zeus, the great Greek oracular god, and in Greek language, equally intelligible to him and his escort, the prophet had in addressing him described him as son of the god. This meant that he was saluted as son of Zeus, and must have entered his soul like a flash of lightning, and caused the deepest emotion. Informed the utterance was not an oracle. He consulted the oracle later, but the prophet had saluted him in the sacred spot, and in the name of the god. Alexander beheld in this a revelation of the god, a revelation which he took on trust as a confirmation of the special divine protection under which he had long felt himself, and as a recognition of the divine power working in him, which had led him to his unprecedented successes. He could believe in this all the more, since according to Greek conceptions, superhuman deeds raised a man into the divine sphere. All his life long Alexander clung to this mystic faith that he was the son of Zeus Ammon. Thereby he disowned his natural father Philip as little as any pharaoh had disowned his father, because he was simultaneously son of Ra, and also of other gods besides. Mysticism and reality ran thus on parallel lines. To the end of his life, Alexander dutifully recognized Philip as his father. However, much his policy might diverge from that of Philip. On the other hand, how deeply he was moved by his divine sonship is shown by the fact that he decided later that he would be buried in the oasis near his father Ammon. Yet he never thought of introducing a political cult of himself as son of Zeus, nor do we hear in our certainly very incomplete tradition that he took any steps to propagate or even to proclaim his divine sonship. Actually, the news of this startling event soon spread far and wide. Before he left Egypt, ambassadors came from Miletus, who reported that the sacred spring in the temple of Berthélemy, which had dried up since the time of Xerxes, had begun to flow again, and that the oracle had confirmed Alexander as son of Zeus, while the Sibyl of Erethe also recognized him as such. It is possible, and not improbable, that Alexander was interested in the rapid spread of the news, but proofs of any official measures taken are not to be found, nor can the work of Callisthenes, in which the event was explicitly described, explain the rapidity with which the news was spread, for it was not published till 330. It is conceivable enough, however, that the friends and companions who were witness of the salutation sent word of it home as soon as possible, as Alexander himself no doubt related it in that letter to his mother. That the first echo of the news came from Ionia is not accidental. In Ionia, Alexander, as liberator from the Persian yoke, was more popular than in Hellas, and the Ionians had formerly paid divine honors to Lysander in his lifetime. It must be emphasized that outside Egypt, this idea of Alexander's divine sonship produced effect only in the Greek world, which in Zeus Ammon revered the supreme oracular god, but, on the contrary, not among the Macedonians, who were quite alien and hostile to such ideas. Apart from the closest friends in Alexander's suite, nor among the Asiatics, who knew nothing about Ammon. But even within the Greek world, it appears that it was left to everyone to decide what attitude he should take up to the divine sonship. Though the oracle was kept secret by Alexander, yet when some time had elapsed, Granicus had the impudence to tell his readers minutely what questions Alexander put to the oracle. First, he asked whether the god would give him worldwide dominion, and next whether he had punished all of Philip's murderers. Later authors eagerly seized on these obvious inventions, and some people believe them to this very day. They are recorded by Plutarch. In other respects, too fancy laid hold of the events at the Oasis, since among the Greeks the divine sonship attracted more attention than the favorable oracle, of whose contents nothing had been heard. The idea arose that Alexander had gone to Ammon to obtain recognition as his son. Again, it was Granicus who introduced into literature this falsification of history, and so what was merely an unforeseen accident became the goal of the journey. Stories were even invented that Alexander sent on messengers ahead to demand of the priest recognition as son of Ammon. The explanation of the journey by Alexander's claim of divine sonship not only had the widest circulation in antiquity, but dominates modern students too. From this premise, the most varied conclusions are drawn. It is concluded that even in his earlier years, Alexander aimed at receiving divine honors, or political motives are ascribed to him, and it is thought he went to the Oasis to secure another basis for his relation to Greeks and Macedonians. This falls with the premise. On the other hand, the effort of the Greeks to analyze the idea of divine sonship in a rationalistic way led to the tale that Ammon himself, in the form of his sacred serpents, had had intercourse with Olympias. Others again knew that Olympias had confessed this intercourse to her husband Philip, whereupon he repudiated her as an adulteress. Thus, in the course of time, a luxuriant growth of legends, myths, and fantastic inventions gathered around the march of Alexander to the Oasis, and concealed the real facts. On his return journey, Alexander made directly for Memphis, following the desert route by Gara and Mokhara, which takes 18 days to cover. At Memphis, following the desert route by Gara and Mokhara, which takes 18 days to cover. At Memphis, many embassies from Greece awaited him, and he was in the mood to receive them graciously. From Antipater came 400 newly enlisted Greek mercenaries and 500 Thracian cavalry. Alexander then offered sacrifice to Zeus the king, and again made a solemn procession with his army under arms, and held a gymnastic and musical competition. It is a mistake to see in this god either the god of the Oasis or the Osiris of Memphis. This Zeus the king is nothing but the pure Greek Zeus. It is significant that the young son of Zeus offers his first sacrifice to the Greek Zeus, not to some Egyptian god. By his elevation to the position of son of Zeus, his Greek character is evidently enhanced, and under the influence of those feelings, he prepares this magnificent festival for Zeus in the capital of Egypt. While there, Alexander showed himself a true Greek by sending a scientific expedition to the Sudan. The question how to explain the Nile inundation, which begins in summer, had long given rise to lively discussion among Greek scientists, and it was Aristotle who had instigated his pupil to get the question settled by eyewitnesses. Accordingly, Alexander dispatched an expedition of scholars up the Nile to study the cause of its inundations. How far they went, we do not know. At any rate, they returned with the correct answer, that the swelling of the Nile is produced by summer rains in the Abyssinian mountains. When Aristotle heard the result of the scientific expedition, he rode triumphantly on the question. This is no longer a problem. Here, for the first time, we see Alexander as his docile pupil, who with enthusiasm places himself and his enterprise at the disposal of science. In the organization of Egypt, which Alexander arranged before his departure, it is noticeable that he did not concentrate the administration in the person of one satrap. He preferred, instead, decentralization. probably because he did not wish to entrust to one individual a country of such economic importance, and so easy to hold from the military point of view, owing to its natural frontiers. In another respect, too, Alexander's arrangement presents a special feature. Previously in Caria, he had shown by the appointment of Ada that he was ready to pay regard to the national feelings of the subjected people. Similarly, in Egypt, he placed 2 natives at the head of the civil administration of Upper and Lower Egypt, while he assigned the western and eastern frontier districts of the Delta, Libya and Arabia, near Hieropolis, to the Greek Apollonius and the Nocratite Cleomenes. The 2 Egyptians were coupled with 2 Macedonian military governors, and the fortresses of Memphis and Pelusium received their special commandants. In contrast to this decentralization, the whole administration of finance was placed in the hands of Cleomenes of Naucratis. The heads of districts had to pay the taxes to him, after they had raised them in their own districts in the fashion previously adopted. No doubt the population were heartily glad that the collection of taxes was not in foreign, but in native hands. When Alexander departed, he was accompanied by the affection of the Egyptians, who felt themselves free of the load which had rested on them since the reconquest by Ochus. The legend might well arise that Alexander was in reality the son of the last native king, Nectanebo II. At the beginning of spring 331, he started from Memphis and proceeded to Phoenicia, where he spent some time at Tyre. Here he made many more changes in the government of the territories conquered up to that date. It is worth mentioning that he created 2 important offices of finance, one for Asia Minor, west of Taurus, and another for Cilicia, Phoenicia, and Syria. When he finally granted to an Athenian embassy the surrender, which he had previously refused, of the Athenians captured at the Granicus, it was because he wanted just then to influence popular opinion at Athens. While in Hellas, Agis was busy in beating up recruits for an alliance against him. Agis had won a victory over a Macedonian force in the past winter, and in the spring he had succeeded in attracting to his side Elis, the Achaeans, all but Pelene, and the Arcadians, all but Megalopolis. If the Persian fleet had still been in existence, this situation would scarcely have permitted Alexander to march away into the heart of Asia. But as he now controlled the sea, he could rely on Antipater and be satisfied with sending his fleet, to be reinforced by 100 more ships from Cyprus and Phoenicia in order to protect the Peloponnesians who remained faithful. The great king, after Alexander abruptly declined his second offer, had begun vigorously to collect a great army at Babylon. This time, as the West was lost, it was the eastern peoples of the empire who supplied the chief troops. Besides the Persians and Medes, there were the fine races of East Iran, the Bactrians and Sogdians, under Bessus the satrap of Bactria, the Arcosians and Arians, the Parthians, Hyrcanians, and others. The Scythian Sakai, not as subjects but as allies, sent a contingent, and the Indians who dwelt this side of the Indus sent 15 elephants. Again, we must reject the usual fantastic numbers. Most writers mention 1 million infantry and 40,000 cavalry, but the countermeasures of Alexander make it unquestionable that he had to face a very great preponderance of force. The statement that this Persian army was far larger than that which fought at Issus is unquestionably correct. Moreover, obviously because of his experience at Issus, Darius had to some extent improved the arming of his troops. He set great store by his 200 scythe cars, with scythes on the wheels and long spears at the tip of the pole, which, like the tanks of today, were to spread death and destruction in the enemy lines. One must recognize that he made thorough preparation for the decisive battle. The choice of the battlefield is also to be commended. Realizing that he had suffered most at Issus from limitations of space, this time Darius chose a wide plain, as he had endeavored to do at Sukhoi. It was on the left bank of the Tigris, north of the old city of the 4 gods, Arbela, today Erbil, and thither he led his army from Babylon, as soon as he heard that Alexander had started from Phoenicia. From Tyre, Alexander marched northwards to the Euphrates in order to cross the river at Thapsacus. His pioneers had already begun to build 2 big bridges over the Euphrates, but had not completed them, for on the other side was Mosaic, the satrap of Syria and Mesopotamia, with several thousand men stationed there less to prevent the crossing than to spy out the approach of Alexander. Since it was in Darius's interest to draw Alexander over the Euphrates and Tigris to the battlefield which he had himself selected, accordingly, as soon as Alexander appeared before Thapsacus, Mosaic vanished. The bridges were completed, and Alexander led his army over unmolested. From here he turned northwards into the northern Mesopotamia, probably by the old caravan road to Karan and Edessa, and then proceeded south of the Armenian foothills eastwards by way of Nisibis to the Tigris. On approaching it, he received from captured Persian spies the false report that Darius was awaiting him on the other side of the Tigris to prevent his passage. But when by forced marches he reached the river, he found neither Darius nor even any watching force of Persians, and was able to cross the Tigris without opposition, but not without some difficulty, for this rapid river here justifies its name, swift as an arrow. While his army was resting on the eastern bank, there was a partial eclipse of the moon. Our astronomers calculate that it occurred on the evening of September 20th, 331. Alexander then sacrificed to Selene, Helios, and Ge, moon, sun, and earth, whose work, as Arrian correctly adds, the eclipse was supposed to be. As Alexander selected these gods, it may be assumed that he understood the cause of an eclipse of the moon, though, to allay the excitement in his army caused by the phenomenon, he had recourse to the seers. Marching in a southeasterly direction between the Tigris and the Kurdish mountains, in search of Darius, he passed near the ruins of ancient Nineveh, probably without having the least idea of the historical importance of the country, just as the Assyrian Empire was once broken by the destruction of Nineveh in 612. So now the Persian Empire was to receive its death blow in the battle at the village of Gaugamela, not far away to the east. Here Darius had found a battlefield suited to his purpose. His dispositions have been exactly recorded, for after the victory the battle order was found in the royal camp. In the center, where again according to ancient precedent, was the king himself in his chariot, was arrayed with his mountain guard, the so-called kinsmen, and the Persian infantry of the guard, the so-called apple-bearers, with golden pomegranates on their spears, covered right and left by the Greek mercenaries, who, as at Issus, were specially designed to engage the Macedonian phalanx. Left and right the 2 wings spread out, of combined cavalry and infantry. On the extreme left the Bactrian cavalry, the Dahai, Rhacotians, and others. On the right wing the Medes, Parthians, and so on. In front of the 2 wings Scythians and more Bactrian cavalry were on the left, on the right Armenian and Cappadocian cavalry. Before the center the 15 elephants, led by their Indian mahots. The 200 scythe cars were distributed in front of the whole line, 100 of them opposite Alexander's right wing. Over the entire battlefield Darius had removed all unevenness of ground, so as to give a smooth path of attack for his cavalry and chariots. Alexander's intention was to use the oblique formation in this battle, as he had previously done. So his line was again divided into an offensive right wing, which he commanded in person, and a defensive left under Parmenio. Once more the position of the Heteroi was on the right, of the Thessalian cavalry on the left, and of the Macedonian phalanx in the center. But as Alexander, on account of the great numerical superiority of his opponent, was afraid of being outflanked or even surrounded, he set a second battle line behind his front, with orders, in case there was a risk of being encircled, to run round and face the enemy's attack in the rear. If this happened, the troops arranged left and right of his front, who in the other circumstances were to prolong the line, would wheel and unite together the 2 lines of battle and fight facing the flanks. Thus, in the event of being encircled, Alexander's army would have formed a square. But the contingency was not realized, and this idea, produced by the necessity of the situation, of an elastic double front, which in case of need might develop into a square, we see the genius he possessed for tactics. It was quite an original idea. At the news of Alexander's arrival, Darius had arrayed his army in line of battle on September 30th. Acting on the advice of Parmenio, Alexander did not accept the challenge, but pitched his camp at a distance of about 4 miles, and, as pit traps or similar obstacles were suspected, he rode over the battlefield with a few attendants to reconnoiter. In the evening, he made his men prepare their food and then take a thorough night's rest. His army thus was perfectly fresh to meet the enemy on the morning of October the 1st, 331. While the unfortunate Persians had been obliged to spend the whole night in full armor, ready for battle, as Darius feared a night attack. Parmenio advised a surprise by night, but Alexander rejected his advice, saying that it was disgraceful to steal the victory. As Alexander approached from the north, he found himself, since his line was far shorter than the Persian, with his right wing exactly opposite Darius and the Persian center. Accordingly, he inclined his advance more and more to the right, so that, as in the earlier battles, he might charge the left wing. The consequence was that the Persians, who also advanced, moved in the same direction. Darius, however, fearing that in this way they would get on to ground not previously leveled, ordered his Scythian and Bactrian horse, who were in front of his left wing, to take Alexander in the flank. Alexander sent to meet them the light cavalry, whom he had posted before the extreme right to deal with such an emergency. While a vigorous cavalry engagement was taking place, the scythed chariots were launched against Alexander's right, but this attack, on which Darius had rested his chief hopes, was a complete failure. Partly the drivers were shot down or pulled out of their carts by the Agranians, an archer stationed for the purpose, and partly, by quick withdrawal, Alexander's troops formed lanes, through which the chariots drove without doing much damage, till finally they were overpowered by Alexander's grooms, a maneuver brilliantly executed, which recalls the events at the Shipka Pass. The two lines of battle were drawing close, when Alexander observed that opposite to him a gap had occurred in the Persian left, through the detachment by Darius of more troops of horse to support the Scythians and Bactrians. His eagle eye saw that the moment was come for the offensive blow. At the head of his heteroi, he rushed into the gap, and began, wheeling to the left, to roll up the enemy's line towards the center, while soon the Macedonian phalanx with their long pikes opened a fierce attack from the front. When Darius, alarmed by this lightning-like change in the situation, perceived the fierce attack of Alexander, as at Issus he turned his chariot around, and was the first to flee. The guards who were nearest formed a body round him, and soon the remaining troops of the center and left wing followed suit. On this occasion, too, Alexander was unable to take up the pursuit at once and win a complete victory with the capture of Darius. His left wing under Parmenio was still engaged in a very dangerous struggle with the Persian right under Mazias, who had succeeded in outflanking his adversary. The senseless flight of Darius was the more unpardonable, since the battle as a whole had not yet been decided. Moreover, the Indian and Persian cavalry of the right wing had succeeded in penetrating a gap, caused by the rapid advance of the phalanx, and in piercing Alexander's second line, but instead of wheeling round and attacking this from front behind, the undisciplined Orientals rushed on to plunder Alexander's camp. The well-led second line then, according to Alexander's tactical plan, in its turn wheeled round and took them in the rear, compelling them to retire hastily after severe loss. It was these retreating masses of cavalry that Alexander encountered, when at Parmenio's urgent request he was hurrying to his aid. The cavalry engagement which ensued was the more bloody, as the Indians and Persians now fought desperately for their lives. Alexander lost in this affray no less than 60 of his heteroi, and Hephaestion, his favorite friend, was wounded. When the Oriental cavalry had forced their way through and escaped, and Alexander could hasten on to Parmenio, it appeared that his help was no longer necessary. The Thessalian cavalry had in the meantime proved victorious. The victory was complete along the whole line. At length, Alexander was able to take up the pursuit of Darius. As long as light lasted, he hurried after him. After giving his cavalry a rest on the other side of the Lycus, the upper Zab, he started again at midnight and arrived the next day at Arbela, where he found Darius's treasure and baggage, but the chief prize of victory was lost. The king could not be caught up. He had too great a start. With only a few attendants, he escaped over the Kurdish mountains into Media. At Arbela, Alexander abandoned the chase. Instead of following the fugitive into the unknown, he rightly regarded it as more important, first to harvest the fruits of victory, and occupy the central lands of the Achaemenids, with their chief palaces and treasure houses. In sure expectation of these results, he now officially adopted the title of King of Asia, which the oracle of Gordian had promised him, and which he had claimed in his first letter to Darius. When we are told that after the battle he was publicly proclaimed King of Asia, this act of recognition can only have proceeded from the assembly of the Macedonian army, although hitherto it had merely had the right and opportunity to acclaim kings of Macedonia. Alexander no doubt gave them the idea and the formula, the proclamation of sovereignty, which marked the climax of the celebration of the victory of the Arbela, was accompanied by magnificent sacrifices to the gods and riches presented to his friends. It is especially interesting to notice that Alexander not only presented himself to them in the light of the conqueror of Asia, but also ostentatiously marked his position as hegemon of the Corinthian League. After the victory, he ordered that in the territory of the Greek allies, all tyrannies should be put down, and that all cities concerned should receive back their autonomy. He must have known that in the interval, Antipater had favored tyrannies in some instances, and that this had caused much bad blood in Greece. His anxiety concerning the results of the conflict with King Agis, of which he then knew nothing, must have suggested this edict as a means of preventing further adhesions to the side of Agis. If, as appears, he issued the order without the cooperation of the Sanhedrion, he could count on the gratitude and approval of the whole Greek world, though probably he had exceeded his powers as hegemon. In this connection, it is credibly stated that after the victory, he reassured the Plataeans as to the building of their city, which Philip had promised them after Chaeronea. His reason, he declared, was that their forefathers had given their territory in the struggle of the Greeks for freedom from the Persians in 479. Furthermore, he sent presents of booty to Croton in Lower Italy, because their city, Phalus, had been the only Italian Greek to fight on the side of the Hellenes at Salamis. Alexander thus connected his own victory with the ancient victories of Plataea and Salamis, and again emphasized the national pan-Hellenic character of the war. Before the battle, too, he had already given proof of his special relation to the allied Greeks of his army. As he rode along the front, he came to the Thessalian and other cavalry of the Greek League, and when they cried out to him that he should lead them against the barbarians, he took his spear in his left hand, and lifting his right to heaven, prayed that if he was really the son of Zeus, the gods would assist the Hellenes. At this moment of intense excitement, when perhaps the recollection of the favorable oracle of Ammon strengthened his confidence of victory, the confession of his divine sonship came to his lips, and as son of Zeus, he prayed the gods to help the Hellenes of his army. What he had previously said to his Macedonians on the right wing and in the center, we are not told, but we may be perfectly certain that to them he said nothing of his divine sonship, for he was only son of Zeus to the Greeks. From Arbela, Alexander led his army southward to Babylon. Expecting resistance, he approached in battle array, but Mazaeus, who had hurried from Gaugamela to Babylon and taken over the command, came out with his sons in suppliant's dress to meet him and surrendered the city. He was followed in solemn procession by the leading men of the seating, among them Bagophanes, the commandant of the fortress, and the Persian and Babylonian priests, and the whole population, as far as it had not already taken up its post on the city walls, thronged out in great curiosity to see their new king. It was a memorable spectacle full of meaning for the history of the world, when, at the head of his troops in glittering armor, through streets decorated with flowers and wreaths, and between altars from which clouds of incense were rising, Alexander entered this ancient metropolis of the Orient, which since the days of Hammurabi had been the soul of the East, and now for the first time received within its walls a Western conqueror. Alexander occupied the royal castle, and after its severe fighting, his army enjoyed itself in their luxurious quarters in the sinful Babel. Alexander, by his victory of Gaugamela, having abolished Persian rule over Babylon, the Babylonians, like the Egyptians, saw in him their new king, and through their priests offered him a separate sovereignty, which he accepted. Thus, by personal union, he connected Babylon, like Egypt, with the rest of his Asiatic empire. It was a peculiarity of the Babylonian monarchy that, since the days of Hammurabi, about year 2000, who made Babylon the capital of Babylonia, it had concluded the claim to world sovereignty, a conception which in the 3rd millennium had already played a part in the history of Mesopotamia. From the time of Hammurabi it had been Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, and Semitic Bel, who, along with the throne of Babylon, conferred also the rule over the 4 quarters of the globe, and he alone was counted lawful king, who at the New Year festival had clasped the hands of Marduk in his temple. This prescription had been observed by successive dynasties and by Cyrus, the founder of the Achaemenid line, Darius I also, whose sovereignty had been given him by Ahura Mazda, according to his own documents, was to the Babylonians king of Babylon, king of the countries, as the Babylonian text state. But after putting down the rebellion of Tarsia in 479, his son Xerxes had broken with this ritual. He destroyed the temple of Marduk, Sagela, carried away the image, and put an end to the separate kingdom of Babylon, and the Achaemenids never afterward styled themselves kings of Babylon. The separate position of Babylon was first restored by Alexander, in order to meet the religious feeling of his new subjects as far as possible, as he had done in Egypt, and especially to set himself right with the priest, erroneously called Chaldeans by the Greeks and Romans. He gave orders soon after his entry for the rebuilding of the temples destroyed by Xerxes, and in particular the temple of Marduk. In other ways he endeavored to carry out the wishes of the priests, and, as Arrian tells us, offered sacrifice to Marduk, according to their directions. This was the royal sacrifice, which the Tyrians refused to let him offer in their city. The old traditions, which Alexander had now taken over, connecting with world domination the sovereignty of Babylon, must have been very welcome to him, but they scarcely gave him anything new. This Babylonian world dominion had in practice been simply the claim to lordship over Asia, possibly including Egypt. It meant simply the sovereignty over Asia, promised him at Gordian, and officially confirmed to him by the assembly of the army at Arbela before he reached Babylon. It would therefore not be correct to derive from the Babylonian traditions these claims to rule over Asia. Nevertheless, it might be valuable to Alexander to find in the old metropolis of the Orient respectful confirmation for that which he had acquired by his own right hand. For the proclamation of Arbela was really only a consequence of his gigantic exploits, as in Egypt Alexander had placed natives at the head of the civil government, so henceforth, on the conquest of country after country he bestowed, as king of Asia, these functions on Persians with the title of satrap. This was done for the first time in Babylon, and Alexander's special position as king of Babylon may have contributed to the result. To Mosaic he assigned the satrapy in gratitude for his surrender of the strong fortress. Beside Mosaic, as civil governor, he placed to keep him in check a Macedonian general with command over the troops. Finance and taxation were also severed from the satrapy and entrusted to a Macedonian. On this principle, Alexander regulated the administration of the other satrapies of the East, till again changes proved necessary. As an exceptional measure, which was soon cancelled, Mosaic, as satrap, was entrusted with the coining of money. From Babylon, where he stopped about a month, Alexander marched eastwards and arrived in 20 days at Susa, the old capital of Elam, which had been the chief seat of government under the Achaemenids. In cooler Ecbatana, they stayed for the hot summer months only, and also in winter or spring spent some time in Babylon. What a part of Susa had played in the Greek world since Aeschylus, and particularly since the shameful peace of Anticleots. How many embassies of opposing Greek states had waited in the great king's antechamber! Alexander as Macedonians now marched in without striking a blow. How anxious he was to secure the city and the treasures it contained is shown by his sending Philoxenus reached him on the way, announcing that the inhabitants of Susa had surrendered the town and that the treasure was intact. For the first time, Alexander got possession of one of the great treasure depots of the Persian kings. They were of a peculiar nature. Darius I had introduced the coining of money into the empire, which had hitherto been administered on the basis of an exchange of natural products, and had imposed on the satraps money tribute besides tribute in kind. But the old system prevailed afterwards as before. Instead of putting into circulation the cash received, he and his successors amassed it in their chief palaces, and in the primitive manner related by Herodotus, melted it down into ingots of gold and silver, from which in case of need, bars were cut off and made into coined money. Though Darius Kodomanas had spent vast sums on the war, and also taken much into the field and lost it, Alexander found still colossal treasures in his palaces, when it is stated that at Susa, apart from the previous precious stones, 40,000 silver talents and 9,000 coined darics of gold fell into Alexander's hands. The first figure alone implies a valuation, in Persian silver talents, of uncoined gold and silver bullion amounting to about 14 million pounds, upon date of publishing in the 1930s. He was accordingly enabled to give Menes, whom he sent from Susa to the sea, as the new director of finance for Cilicia, Phoenicia, and Syria, 3,000 talents, with the order to pay Antipater as much as he required for the war with Agis, for no news had yet been received of the conclusion of this conflict. The occupation of Susa was performed with great solemnity. Alexander sacrificed to the Macedonian gods according to ancestral ritual, and ordered a torch race and gymnastic contests to follow. He left as satrap the Persian Abilites, who had surrendered the city to him, but placed at his side 2 Macedonians as commander of the troops and citadel commandant. While at Susa, he was reinforced by several thousand fresh troops from Macedonia. In incorporating the mounted men into the heteroi, he created a new organization by dividing the regiments, Ile, for the first time into 2 squadrons, Lokoi, and giving each squadron a commander of its own, Lokagos. This was the first of a great number of reforms, which were gradually introduced into the organization of his army. Alexander's next goal was Persepolis. After crossing the Pasitigris, he reached the land of the Uxi. While the inhabitants of the plain submitted to him, the untamed mountaineers demanded that he should purchase by presents leave to cross the territory, as the Persian kings had previously done. Alexander refused to yield to this demand, as he was not willing to recognize the independence of any tribe in his empire, and by a stratagem succeeded in turning their position and overcoming them. Thereupon he imposed on them an annual tribute of horses, drought animals, and sheep, for this mountain tribe knew no money and depended upon stock breeding. While he made Parmenio march with the Greek troops along the high road, which had been made for the Persian court from Susa to Persepolis, he himself with his Macedonians hurried through the mountains by a shorter route to the Persian gates. Here he met with serious resistance. The satrap of Persia, Ariobarzanes, had drawn a wall across the pass and was awaiting him with a superior force. Only after heavy fighting, and by help of a bold turning maneuver, did he succeed in putting the enemy to flight. He then sped down into the plain, over the Araxes, which had been a bridge in the interval, and on the Persepolis, in order to reach the town before its garrison had time to plunder the treasures. He was in time to secure them. Alexander now set foot in the native land of the Achaemenids, the great Cyrus, founder of the empire and the dynasty, had erected his capital with palace and sepulchre at Pasargadae, near the modern Mesheri Magab, close to the battlefield on which he overcame Astyages, the Median. Later, Darius I built southeast of this the strong citadel of Persepolis, within the walls of which he and his successors erected the residences and their open audience halls, Apadana, supported by columns on a high terrace to which a double staircase led, richly decorated with reliefs. The ruins of the royal buildings at Persepolis, Takti de Shimshed, even today produce an overwhelming impression. The huge columns rising to heaven, the great bulls at the portal, the reliefs and inscriptions bear witness to the power and splendor of a world empire, which believed itself secure for all time by the grace of Ahura Mazda. On the wall of the staircase leading up to the terrace are these proud words in cuneiform: "Thus saith King Darius, this land of Persia, which Ahura Mazda had granted me, which is fair, rich in men and rich in horses, according to the will of Ahura Mazda, and of me King Darius trembles before no enemy." Now it lay defenseless at the feet of Alexander. At Persepolis, Alexander not only felt himself to be the new master, who, by the conquest of this hallowed home of Persian tradition, had laid the axe to the root of the Achaemenid power, but also appeared once more in the role of generalissimo of the Corinthian League, who had taken over from the Sanhedrion the task of conducting the Pan-Hellenic war with Persia, to take vengeance for the crimes that Xerxes had formerly committed against the gods and temples of the Hellenes. Beyond all human expectation, he had carried his victorious arms into the land from which the Persians took their origin. Yet his victories over the present ruler Darius did not count as vengeance on the dead Xerxes. Here, where Xerxes had erected his palace, his magnificent hall of audience, and the great portal in the sacred precincts of Persepolis, here should his memory be blotted out for all time and retribution be exacted. At Alexander's orders, torches were hurled into the buildings of King Xerxes, and in the process the others were partially destroyed. It was a symbolical act by which to the listening world, and especially to the Greeks, he was intended to proclaim in an unparalleled coup d'etat that the campaign of vengeance had fulfilled its object. One of the fables of Granicus related subsequently that after a wild orgy of intoxication, Alexander, incited by the fair Athenian hetera, Veus, fired the palace. Naturally, this was eagerly repeated by later writers, and finds credence even today. It was at Persepolis that Alexander finally received the news of Antipater's victory, which relieved him of a great anxiety. He had sent him money from Susa for the struggle with Agis, who, as we have already said, had formed a Peloponnesian coalition against Alexander in the spring of 331. Antipater had not been able to march against him at once, since he was detained by a rising in Thrace. After he had ended that war as quickly as possible, he hurried southwards, levied, in the sense of the treaty obligations of the League of Corinth, contingents from the Greek allies on the way, as it was a case of punishing the allies of the Spartans, if not the Spartans themselves, and entered Peloponnesus with an army which totaled 40,000. Here, Agis, with his allies, had assembled 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, and was besieging Megalopolis in Arcadia, which had remained faithful to Alexander. Before the walls of the city, about the same time that Alexander was winning the victory of Gaugamela, there was a great battle in which, notwithstanding the most valiant resistance of his enemy, Antipater won a decisive victory. King Agis, the heart and soul of the struggle for freedom, after receiving many wounds, fell in the battle, and the vanquished, even Sparta, had to beg for peace. Antipater took as hostage 50 of the noble Spartans, and referred the decision to the Sanhedrion, as Alexander had done after the conquest of Thebes. But the Sanhedrion, which met for an extraordinary session at Corinth, was weak enough to dissolve the decision on Alexander. So later, when the Spartan hostages arrived, Alexander held the trial, punishing some and forgiving others, and forced the Spartans to join the League of Corinth. Alexander rested his army at Persepolis during the winter once. Though small raids were launched upon insubordinate tribes in Persis, the satrap of Carmania, the next province to the east, fortunately made his submission and was accordingly left in office. The treasures that Alexander found in Persepolis were 3 times as great as those of Susa. They were calculated at 120,000 Persian talents, about 42 million pounds in 1930s money. Besides that, at Pasargadae, which was surrendered to him without fighting, he obtained from the treasure house of Cyrus 6,000 Persian talents, 2,100,000 pounds. During his visit to Pasargadae, he paid significant respect to the memory of Cyrus by ordering Aristobulus to decorate the interior of the sepulchral chamber in Cyrus's tomb. The tomb is still preserved. It is the first token we have of Alexander's great veneration for the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, and it is noteworthy that he showed it before the death of Darius, before he felt himself to be the heir of Cyrus. It had been conjectured that the reading of Xenophon's Cyropaedia roused his admiration for Cyrus at an early age. With the beginning of the spring of 330, Alexander set out to occupy the last of the Persian capitals, Ecbatana, Hamadan, in Media. It was reported that Darius was to be found there. After the defeat of Gaugamela, he had escaped over the Kurdish mountains with a few troops to Ecbatana. Presently, as further units from the wreck of the army came in, he began to build up fresh forces. He hoped that Alexander and his troops would stay long in the luxurious quarters of his western palaces, or that he would not proceed further than Susa, and would be contented with Asia west of the Kurdish mountains, which form a huge rampart bearing off the Iranian countries from the west. Should Alexander march against him, he planned to retreat to Bactria in the far east, and make the road thither impassable for him by devastating the country as he went. At any rate, he sent on the harem and the baggage train to the Caspian gates, and waited the course of events at Ecbatana. As Alexander was marching northwestwards in the direction of Ecbatana, having subdued the Para-Athenians on the way, it was reported to him that Darius, trusting to Scythian and Cadutian reinforcements, meant to offer him in battle. Immediately he left his baggage train behind and hurried forward in battle order. Soon he heard that the reinforcements had not come, and that Darius had resolved to flee, and though he pressed on by forced marches, he reached Ecbatana too late. A week before, Darius had escaped eastward with 3,000 cavalry and 6,000 infantry, taking with him the 7,000 talents stored there. It was a great disappointment. In all haste, Alexander took only the most necessary steps in arranging for the west, and began the pursuit. If by the conflagration at Persepolis he had shown the Greeks that he regarded the war of revenge as finished, he now carried this idea to its logical end by dismissing and sending home with rich rewards the Thessalian cavalry and the contingents of the other Greek allies. Thanks to the victory of Megalopolis, he had Greece under his thumb, and no longer needed to take about with him these allied troops as security or as hostages. Not a few of them preferred, with his permission, to continue in his service, but as mercenaries, and no longer as allies. His special command as unlimited strategos of the campaign of revenge with which he was entrusted in 336 by the Sanhedrion at Corinth. Alexander regarded as having expired. Hegemon of the League, he remained as before. It was the life appointment, and up to his last days he acted officially in that capacity. But the Pan-Hellenic campaign was now a thing of the past. The enthusiasm with which, at the age of 20, he had taken up this idea 6 years before, must have long ago have been chilled by the sad experiences he had had in the meantime with the Greeks of the motherland. Yet he had never renounced it, even though from his first crossing over into Asia, the idea of conquest had stood with it side by side. He had succeeded in connecting the two by the ambition, which still continued to inspire him, to pave the way for Greek culture in the East, but now he had no longer two separate aims in the war, and could devote himself to the idea of conquest without let or hindrance. It speaks for Alexander's importance as a statesman that before he plunged into the Far East, he centralized the whole finance administration. He caused Parmenio, who had brought from Persepolis the treasures of Susa about Persepolis, totaling 180,000 Persian talents, about 63 million pounds in 1930s money, to deposit them in the citadel of Ecbatana and hand them over to Harpalus, who had hitherto directed the military chest, and was now appointed imperial treasurer. Alexander was determined to break with the hoarding policy of the Persian kings, and ordered the inception of a gold and silver currency. The effects of this act were momentous. To Parmenio, he entrusted the safeguarding of the imperial treasurer, and left him with a division at Ecbatana, also with the all-important duty of securing the communications in the rear. It was a very honorable and extremely irresponsible command, which was conferred on the meritorious old general. Yet he himself may have felt it as a slight, and very likely he was not wrong. Not only his 70 years, which seemed to unfit him for the great exertions that were impending, but still more the contrast, which had been exhibited so often, between his point of view and Alexander's probably appeared to Alexander as impediments, in prospect of the great changes that were imminent. Thus freed from all restraints, from the pan-Hellenic idea, and from one who was so often an inconvenient mentor, Alexander could turn to the Far East.